Hello, today we are honored to have Dr. Richard Haass, who is the president of the Nonpartisan Council on Foreign Relations, and he has held this position for the past 17 years. Before taking over the council's leadership, he served as the chair for the multi-party negotiations in Northern Ireland. For his efforts, he received the Tipperary International Peace Award. From 2001 to 2003, he served as the director of the State Department's policy planning staff under Secretary of State Colin Powell. He also served as the special assistant and senior Middle East director to President George H.W. Bush. Previously, he served in both the State and Defense Departments and as a U.S. Senate legislative aide. Dr. Haass has been awarded the Presidential Citizen Medal for his leadership and policy contributions to Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. Dr. Haass is a Rhodes Scholar and holds master's and doctorate's degrees from Oxford University. He was also a member of the faculty of Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government and Hamilton College. In his spare time, he has authored and edited 14 books on foreign policy and one on management. As of recently, his book titled The World, A Brief Introduction, is a New York Times bestseller, ranked number 10 on the nonfiction list and 15 on the combined print and ebook list. He is uniquely qualified to address how events impact and countries tackle the world's most vexing issues, having studied, wrote, taught, and served in foreign policy positions throughout his impressive professional career. Richard, it's my honor to welcome you to the show. We are delighted to have you as part of our Day 2 annual Global Innovation 2030 Digital Summit and cannot wait to hear the key insights you bring.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you for having me, and thank you for that overly generous introduction.
Well, absolutely. You certainly deserve it. And congratulations on your book reaching the New York Times bestselling list. That's quite the achievement.
Well, thank you for that as well.
Absolutely. Well, to jump right into current global circumstances, most Americans, and I would suspect people all over the world, feel as though the world has just shut down the past 4 to 5 months. We're hunkered down in our homes with little interaction with others. As the world starts to open up, Richard, what do you see on a global scene will be the most significant changes that COVID-19 has brought about?
Well, a couple of points to make, John. One is even though we're all focused, obviously, on the pandemic, other things haven't stopped. There's no pause button in history. So other things have been going on just in the last few days. Obviously, we've seen the events in Hong Kong, or more quietly, something like climate change simply continues to occur, where North Korea continues to enhance its nuclear and missile capabilities. The Russians are still parked in Ukraine. So there's that reality. In terms of how things are going to open up and what happens, so much depends upon what do we mean by opening up. I call where we are now, we're in a situation of a trans-pandemic world. We're amidst it. I don't know exactly when we get to a post-pandemic world. It'll depend in part upon the virus, in part about what happens on the medical front, in part about how different societies react or handle or contend with this virus. Already, we've seen extraordinary variation within countries and from country to country. So again, it's hard to give you a precise prediction about anything. I would just say, though, and I've argued this in print in our magazine in Foreign Affairs, that a lot of the trends that we saw in place before any of us ever heard of COVID-19, my own sense is a lot of those trends will be visible, they will be recognizable. They may, though, have intensified. History may, because of this virus, find itself accelerating.
Yeah, absolutely. We are certainly in unprecedented times. And, speaking of Hong Kong and China in particular, it is often heard that we're headed into a new Cold War, this time with China, in small part brought on by the genesis of COVID in Wuhan. So do you believe that we are headed into a new Cold War? And if so, what will that mean for the U.S. going forward?
Well, I don't think we're there yet, and nothing's inevitable in history. History is the result of what people decide, what people do. But I think it's also realistic to acknowledge that U.S.-Chinese relations were deteriorating before the pandemic hit, and as a result of the pandemic, they are somewhat worse. But this is a relationship that's been troubled for some time. Think about it. The United States and China really came together only because they both were opposed to the Soviet Union. Then when the Cold War ended, they stayed somewhat close because of their trade and investment. But what's happened in recent decades is trade, rather than being a source of glue, has increasingly become a source of friction between the United States and China. So the relationship lost its foundation. And then on top of that, we have our political differences, given I mentioned Hong Kong, given the Chinese repression of the Uyghur Muslim minority in its country. We have differences over Chinese strategic behavior, particularly in the South China Sea. We have a wide range of economic concerns about what's going on. China, for its part, has problems with certain things that we are doing. So, as I said, this is a relationship that hasn't quite found its rationale, hasn't found its foundation. I would say the stakes are enormous. This is probably or definitely the single most important bilateral relationship in the world. And as goes the United States and China, so will go a lot of history. I've argued against a Cold War if it can be avoided. I don't think China
Mhm.
should be at the center of American foreign policy if we can help it. There's any number of reasons. I think it exaggerates China's capabilities and its aims. It is not, I would argue, the Soviet Union during the Cold War. I think it underestimates China's internal vulnerabilities. We can discuss those if you like. Also, I want to be able to cooperate with China where we can, say against climate change, say against a future pandemic, say to
Mhm.
limit what North Korea does. So I don't want to have a one-dimensional confrontational relationship if I can avoid it.
No, absolutely, and you're right. I think cooperation with China, particularly when it comes to climate change, and for instance, the United Nations 17 Sustainable Goals, is absolutely essential. And so that really segues nicely. That our viewership may be aware, but Ideagen is really focused on furthering those 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And so you talked a little bit about it, but with the world's two superpowers, China and the U.S. kind of having these tensions and squaring off recently. Are we likely to see regression on achieving these goals? And also, what role does globalization play? Is it inevitable? And has COVID changed the way that we look going forward?
There was a couple of questions packed in there. Look, we could find some regression on these goals. Clearly, the goal of global public health, which I think is the third goal, if I remember the SDGs, it's been a bad time for that, even though some of the measures in advance of the pandemic were obviously moving in the right direction. There's been real progress in the world in disease eradication, lowering rates of maternal and infant mortality. But already there were massive problems on what are called NCDs, non-communicable diseases. And I think one of the problems, quite honestly, with global health policy and even with the SDGs is they don't place nearly enough emphasis on things like diabetes, cancer, goals that are often associated with lifestyle, drug abuse, alcoholism, coronary disease, so things associated also with smoking. So that problem was enormous, and the world wasn't doing enough. Now, obviously, on top of that, we've got this new infectious disease, COVID-19. So in the area of global public health, shall we say, the plate is full, and we'll see how well we deal with it. But the knock-on effects are going to be, obviously extraordinarily problematic. And the optimists viewing this might say, well, hopefully this will wake people up and we'll all start cooperating more. Well, maybe, but maybe not. So far, at least, we haven't seen much in the way of international cooperation. Instead, we're seeing countries turn more inward. There's a sense that countries have to look after themselves. Take the United States, for example. We've lost over 100,000 lives. 40 million people are now unemployed. Trillions of dollars of wealth have been lost. So it's going to be hard to persuade a lot of Americans that this is a moment we should be focused on the world, even if one of the basic, if not the basic lesson of the pandemic is that, like it or not, what happens in the world matters. In this case, what began in Wuhan, China, clearly didn't stay in Wuhan, China. And that, to me, is what globalization is all about. To me, globalization is a reality. It's about these flows of everything from computer viruses to real viruses, to people, to guns, to drugs, to dollars, to emails, to carbon dioxide, to you name it. And these flows are in enormous velocity, great speed, enormous volume, and they don't, in most cases, respect borders. And that, to me, is the reality of our time. How you respond to globalization How you respond to each one of these flows, well, that's a matter of foreign policy or domestic policy. But I do think what distinguishes the 21st century and this era of history from all that came before us is globalization. We have all the old challenges. And, we just talked about China, rising China, whether the United States and China can avoid a Cold War. That's the familiar stuff of history. What's new about this era is things like climate change, things like pandemics, things like global terrorism, the reality of cyberspace, the reality of proliferation. It's these global challenges to order and to national and individual well-being that is the qualitatively different characteristic of this era.
Yeah, no, I absolutely couldn't agree with you more. And you have an entire chapter in your book dedicated to climate change. And I certainly hope that coming out of this COVID crisis that we do see cooperation and we do see people coming together, unifying for a cause, seeing that, we've seen small spurts of the environment semi-bouncing back, but that really doesn't seem to be long-term for the time being. And so I absolutely agree with you. And so moving on here, having talked about the U.S.-China dynamic.
John, can I just interrupt for a second?
Absolutely.
30 seconds on climate change.
Sure.
We have seen some temporary improvements in the air in many countries, but that's really because of the economic recession or depression caused by the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
That's temporary. And as people go back to work, and we all hope that people can go back to work, unless there's a fundamental change in behavior or in the use of fuels, any improvement in the air and the atmosphere is going to be temporary. So we haven't seen yet any fundamental changes in climate policy. So let's just be realistic. The
Sure.
challenge is there. I think there's an opportunity if we choose it. A lot of money is going to be dispensed by government to help businesses get back on their feet. One of the questions is, will any of that money be conditioned on businesses adopting more responsible climate-oriented policies? For example, might a government say to an automobile manufacturer, we'll help you, but only if you raise the fuel standards of the cars you're producing? Or might money be given to this or that manufacturing plant, but only if they move away from coal as their principal source of fuel? So I think there could be opportunities here. I'm not sure they will be taken, though, because, again, the priority will be getting people back to work.
Mm-hmm.
Nations will be looking at their own economic revival. And again, it makes the basic point that crises are potential opportunities, but only if that potential is seized. Crises can also be wasted. And I think one of the questions going forward is whether we seize the opportunity created by the awful situation we find ourselves in, or whether we squander it.
Yeah, no, I mean, that is the big question. We certainly hope that, these opportunities aren't wasted coming out of this, and that the nations of the world do seize it. And so, as I said, moving on, what do you see as Russia's emerging role in the world?
It's hard for me to see much positive. When you look at Russia, when you look at Mr. Putin, this is a fundamentally illiberal society. They have no desire to be a part of the world that the United States and others promoted after World War II, when they were back as the Soviet Union, and after the end of the Cold War. I think Mr. Putin sees the kind of liberal democratic values that the United States has traditionally upheld as a threat to his country, as a threat to his personal rule. And what we see is a consecutive pattern of Russian behavior using the military force in Ukraine, in Georgia, in the Middle East. We see interference with democratic elections in this country and elsewhere through cyberspace. We see tremendous illiberalism at home, the killing of journalists and other imprisonment of activists. So all that I see continuing. Now, Mr. Putin is feeling pressure. Energy prices have gone down considerably.
Mm-hmm.
He and his government have not handled the coronavirus epidemic at all well. So, Russia came into the crisis with a terrible public health system that's having trouble managing all the pressure. But I see no signs of Russian behavior improving. I'll say one other thing.
Mm-hmm.
Russia still is the superpower in one area, and that is nuclear weapons. Russia and the United States are different than everybody else there. And the question is, we have an election here, obviously, in November. Well, in February, just a few weeks after whoever wins that election takes up the job of president, whether it's President Trump in a second term or Joe Biden as a new president, they're going to face a situation where the U.S., Russia, the New START agreement, the principal arms control agreement that regulates the long-range nuclear weapons of each side, that agreement is due to expire. And one of the real questions going forward is, can it be extended? And I hope it can, but recent events are not great. We've seen the United States get out of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement on allegations that Russia was not complying. And most recently, just days ago, we saw the United States withdraw from the so-called Open Skies Agreement, essentially an arrangement that allows countries to overfly one another so they can see what's going on in certain areas and reassure themselves both what's going on and what's not going on. So for all these reasons, I can't see any reason to be optimistic about the course of U.S.-Russian relations or about Russia's behavior in the world. And as we've seen, for better but more for worse, what Russia does can still matter.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we had, talked about it a little bit, but given that competition and the challenges that we face with China and Russia, where do you see, Richard, a few areas of cooperation that we could have to advance technology or the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals or society as a whole?
Let's break it down in two ways. With the United States and Russia, I haven't given up on the possibility of some cooperation on nuclear arms control. I think that's still possible. I haven't given up on the possibility, say, with the United States and China, even Russia, on some cooperation dealing with Afghanistan, with North Korea, with China and the United States, possibly on climate, possibly on global health. So I think there are some areas for possible collaboration. More broadly, a lot of the issues in the SDGs, a lot of those are really national challenges when it comes to things like education and so forth. That's really up to governments, either at the national level or at the local level, to put into place policies. It's not the world, for example, that's going to determine the quality of K through 12 education in the United States. That's for states and localities in the United States to determine. But I think there's a possibility, in the area of public health. We've already talked about it, but I think there's a decent chance that there'll be some impetus to improve global public health, particularly when it comes to dealing with infectious disease. I would think that's one area where there could be global increased collaboration. In other areas, we'll just have to see. If you go through the list of 17 goals, as I said, some are national. Something like climate change, obviously the opportunity is there. Again, whether it will be seized, I think that's where, at best, I'm agnostic. We'll know soon enough. My concern, though, is that there will be an inward-looking focus. There will be a focus on getting people back to work, and there may be the viewpoint, which I think is wrong, but it may hold all the same, that governments don't have the luxury to focus on dealing with some of the issues covered by the SDGs, because they've got to focus on domestic health or on domestic economic recovery.
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. And so now turning gears slightly, as I mentioned, you now are a New York Times bestselling author for your book, The World: A Brief Introduction. I currently have a copy of it and started reading it, and it really is quite fascinating. And I encourage our viewers that this is a must read for anyone of any age, education level out there in general, to really get an introduction to, as you say, the world. So, Richard, that's quite a big topic, and it's a big topic written for a big multi-generational audience. There's a line in your book where you say, quote, "There is no limit to the number of questions that could be raised dealing with the world, for the answers could have profound consequences for our lives." So knowing this and having written or edited 14 other books, how did you decide what is important and what is not important for readers to understand about, as you say, the world?
It was actually the hardest question I had to raise and then try to answer in writing this book. And I walked a lot of laps in Central Park. That's the way I tried to think about it. And what I wanted to do was write a single book not for people who had dedicated their lives to the study of the world or foreign policy, but for normal people. I mean, what the young man who stimulated the book was a computer sciences major, and he was about to graduate from Stanford, and he hadn't had any courses in history, in international relations, in politics, and I worried that, okay, once he backed off from the screen, how is he going to be an informed citizen? How is he going to make good choices in his life? And what I found out is that his situation wasn't unique. You can graduate from most high schools in the country. You can graduate from most colleges and universities in the country and not be exposed to the basics about this world that you're going to enter that will affect your life. And if you're older, if you're the parents or grandparent of a college age student, the same holds for you. You may have never studied it. If you did study it, what you studied is largely obsolete. If you watch the nightly news, you're not going to catch much of it. But all of us need to know about this. You got to need to know about it, because this November, you're going to want to cast your vote in a way that's mindful of where the candidates stand on international issues. We've learned the hard way that something like a pandemic can fundamentally change our life. We learned a similar thing at 9/11 when terrorists working out of Afghanistan changed our lives and took 3,000 innocent lives in a single day. People your age, John, have to make career decisions. Should I go into government? Should I go into the military? Should I join the Foreign Service? Should I work in this business that tries to export goods overseas? Should I go work for the International Rescue Committee or Doctors Without Borders or some other NGO? Should I become a journalist that focuses on these issues? Should I work now where you're working? So my view is, and even issues like investing or business, or just say you're on a automobile assembly line, and some politician goes up and says we need to have tariffs, and that will affect your ability to export the cars you're making. Well, is that good or bad for you? And how are you supposed to make an informed decision? So what I try to do is essentially distill the history I thought you needed to know, what I thought you needed to know about the basic regions of the world. Thirdly, what I thought you needed to know about the issues we've been talking about, all the various aspects of globalization. And last, what I thought you needed to know about how the world worked, and try to put it in a volume. Keep it short, not assume any prior knowledge. Every time I mention something, I try to explain it. Try to avoid jargon, abbreviations, all the other stuff people like me traffic in. And I wanted to make it not only interesting, because I think it is interesting, but accessible. And for all I know, this will be the first book that people read in this subject. For all I know, it will be the last book that they read. And again, what I wanted to do was give them a kind of foundation. So then when they went about their lives as a citizen, in the workplace, what have you, that they would simply have a foundation. They would have a way to make sense of this world. I mean, someone your age, one last point, think about it. What year were you born?
97.
Okay. So if you live, and we're counting on it, a normal life, your life will almost exactly track the 21st century.
Yeah.
You're coming of age. Here it is. We're just finishing the second decade. Hopefully you'll live to, close to, or actually see the end of the 21st century. Okay, well, this is going to fundamentally affect your life. This is going to be your life.
Yeah.
And what I wanted to write was a book for someone, say your age, that would put you in good stead, or put you in better stead, give you that foundation. And again, hopefully, as you go through your life, you'll build on it. You'll have, you'll read other things. You'll have all sorts of experiences like the one you're having now. But I thought, again, for starting out, it could help a lot of people. But again, even if you're older, you have to vote this November. And I don't tell people how to vote. I don't tell them what's the quote unquote right answer on any issue. What I try to do is give people tools so they can make better answers for themselves.
Yeah, no, and absolutely. And you're right. You don't tell people how to vote or where to vote, but you absolutely have to vote. And Richard, I couldn't agree more. This book is a foundation. It really is. And it's giving me global insights. I graduated undergrad in 2019, and it's funny you mentioned the introduction of your book, you mentioned that there's 3 courses that you were surprised you didn't take: economics, history, and government relations. And I ironically enough took all 3. However, only one was mandatory, and that's because I had a business degree and economics is essential to that. But the other 2 were electives that I was, kind of pushed to take from my parents, because they were saying, listen, you need to get a globalized view. You need to understand the world and how it works. And so, this book is just it's a continuation of that. And or if someone didn't have that, this is something that they could look to for that. And so, there's a line in your book that says, quote, "It's possible to graduate from nearly any 2 or 4-year college or university in the United States without getting even a rudimentary understanding of the world," something that you had just recently mentioned. And so tell us a little bit about why this is so important, particularly now in today's age and time, and what does this say about our education system?
Yeah, just so no one's confused, because you make the right point. Virtually every college and university offers a whole range of courses.
Mm-hmm.
But very, very few schools in the United States require that you take certain courses. Instead, you may have a distribution requirement that says you have to take 2 courses in history or 2 courses in global issues in order to get your degree. But if there's a range of 50 or 100 courses you can choose from, obviously you can choose something that's narrow, that won't necessarily give you anything like the overview or comprehensive overview that you need. And so again, what I set out to do was provide that sort of comprehensive A to Z, if you prefer, look at the world. And the reason is obvious, that the security of any country, well, we can talk about the United States, but it doesn't have to be just the United States. The future of it is going to, in large part, depend upon not just what happens internally, but what happens externally. We live in a world where we talked about globalization, where borders are not in many cases barriers. The oceans that surround this country are not moats. We can't pull up the drawbridge. So like it or not, the effects of climate change will reach us. In this case, it was the effects of a virus that broke out in China. 9/11, as I said, it was the effect of terrorists coming from Afghanistan, originally from countries in the Middle East. And what I wanted to do was put people in a position where they could better understand the relationship between their country and the world, understand both, not just the threats, but also the opportunities that the world presents, and also the other way around. Think about what you do, how it affects the world. There's a kind of loop about how foreign policy and what individuals and firms do, how it affects the world, and then vice versa, how what goes on in the world affects individuals, their businesses, their communities, and their country. So I wanted people simply to get more aware and get a better understanding. What I'm trying to discourage is any sense that the world doesn't matter. I think to deny what goes on in the world is dangerous. I think isolationism, to simply try to opt out, is similarly futile. The image that comes to mind is the ostrich putting his head in the sand, and the tide comes in and washes it away. And the other thing, and it's consistent with what you and your organization are up to, it's not just that the world matters, but I don't think for the most part there's unilateral answers to it. These are global challenges, and global challenges call for collective responses. And that's the implicit message of the book. Now, again, we can have, and we should have, debates about the content of those collective responses. What is the smartest policy for dealing with global public health, or with climate change, or with terrorists? What should be the rules that regulate cyberspace? What should we do about a North Korean proliferation challenge? We can go on and on through all 17 of the SDGs, for example. Sure. That's a matter for public debate. What I don't think we can debate is that we can ignore these issues, or that we can solve them better ourselves.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we talked a little bit about it, but we're really living in a different era, in modern times. And currently, more information is being generated daily than ever before. And the internet, for better or worse, has allowed people, no matter their level of knowledge or education, to have a platform to millions of people around the world. And so what would you tell someone, Richard, navigating a world where accurate information is scarce and misinformation is abundant?
No, it's a real dilemma. We live in a world where we're flooded 24/7, and as you say, there's the internet is essentially a place of unlimited information, but there are no editors, there's no authenticators, there's no one who says this is good, this isn't. But there's a few places we can go to. Certain newspapers obviously have powerful reputations. In this country, it would be what? The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post at a minimum. There's several other regional newspapers that are good. You then have the Financial Times, I think, is an excellent daily newspaper. You have certain magazines, The Economist, for one, which is a really important read. There's certain television shows or certain radio shows which have built up reputations over the years as being serious and balanced and not having a political agenda. The best magazine in the field, I'll brag, on international relations is our own Foreign Affairs. Full disclosure, we publish at the Council on Foreign Relations. So there's places people can go. I also think, though, it's useful sometimes to go to places on the internet that you disagree with, just to be challenged. I think too many people only go to places on the internet that are a bit of an echo chamber, and I force myself at times. So, like in the old days when I used to go to gyms to work out before this, I would spend some of my time watching all different networks. So while I was on the elliptical, I'd spend, say, 10 minutes on Fox and 10 minutes on CNN and 10 minutes on MSNBC. And if truth be told, probably a few minutes on ESPN, but that's different. And just to be exposed to what different people are thinking. They actually, I have a part of in my book called "Where to Go From Here, Where to Go From More," and essentially, it's to answer your question: how do you stay involved? A book like mine is fine as a start, but people need to have regular access to information. But there's nothing better, and I don't care if you read it in paper or online, than one of the quality daily newspapers or something like a weekly magazine like the Economist. If you had to start, I would start there.
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes out to all of our viewers, because that's something that I was questioning when I'm looking through your book is how do I stay on top of these topics and points of discussion? And absolutely, I agree with all those sources. And, it's difficult to navigate this world and Internet of Things, information and everything like that. But it's essential that we not only fact check and continue to do that, not only with, the sources, but with people putting them out, but at the same time to also to look at that opposing side. You're right. You don't want to constantly be driven to think one way and not have an idea of the other. And debate is an essential process of that, to have those discussions. And so moving on here, Richard, you've had an unbelievable and impactful career. I mean, we mentioned some of your past endeavors and things like that. And so for our younger audience, people similar to myself, if you could go back in time, what bit of advice would you give yourself just starting out in your career?
Look, one is not to overplan it. I didn't sit down at any age and say, this is what, here's the trajectory I'm going to take, and then I've got to check these 6 boxes to get there. My view particularly, well, we'll take it in different stages, John. I'm actually glad you asked for that. When you're on campus, I would simply say study widely. I am an old-fashioned guy who believes in the liberal arts curriculum. Expose yourself. The reason I got into this field in the first place is when I first got to campus, I went to Oberlin College. I asked people who was the best professor on campus, and they said it was this professor of religion, and so forth. And I took the course, and it was fantastic. And that got me interested first in comparative religion. I then got involved in the Middle East, and one thing led to another. I went to the Middle East. I then got involved in international relations. It wasn't by design. It was just where I followed what was interesting, what was intellectually exciting. When I took my early jobs, to me, the most important thing, and it's the biggest piece of advice I could give people, is take the jobs where you learn the most. You want to get stretched. Whether it's how get better at writing, get better at speaking, at advocacy. You want to be in something, hopefully that matters and excites you. But put yourself in jobs where you get stretched. If you're lucky, and you can find a good mentor, someone who will take you under his or her wing, and again, expose you to stuff, show you, give you a chance to get involved. That's great. In my own experience, if you can write well, you're more likely to get those opportunities. When I was a young person in my 20s in the Pentagon, I didn't get invited, shall we say, very frequently to meet the Secretary of Defense or the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. but my memos could get places. And so there's something to be said for good writing. But I think the best thing as a young person is to try many things. Sometimes finding out what's not right for you is just as important as clicking. I mean, I've said this to my own kids. They're both in their late 20s. And there's always pressure, I think, that young people feel to figure it out, to sort it out. I understand the pressure, but my instincts are to say, be easy on yourself, relax. Give yourself 5, maybe more jobs in the first 5 or 7 or 8 years of your post-education career, just where you experience different things, you get exposed to different things. And by a process of elimination, you'll say, well, look, this isn't for me, but that was kind of interesting. Or I like working with large numbers of people, or I really like working on my own. I really like stuff that's heavily intellectual. Or no, actually, I really like stuff that's much more operational, filled with doing. I want to be overseas. I want to be in a city. I want to be in the country, what have you. I like structure. I don't like structure. I want to choose a career path. So I want to join something like the military or the foreign service where there's a clear 30-year possibility, or just the opposite, what have you. It doesn't matter. My point is simply to expose yourself and give yourself a break. Again, the only thing that concerns me, and I see it with so many young people who work for me, and we have hundreds who work at the Council on Foreign Relations, is the pressure that they often feel to figure it out, to sort it out, to make the choice. Think about it. If you're in your 20s now, you will probably have in the course of your career, maybe 25 separate jobs, maybe 20, maybe 30. I've lost count in my case. This is the first time I've ever held a job for more than 4 years, but you're going to move around a lot. And the reason is, your life, but also technology, the market will change. Certain jobs that exist now won't exist in 25 years, and vice versa. In 25 years, there'll be all sorts of new jobs brought into existence because of changing technologies. So get used to the idea of mobility, and think about also the other thing I'd recommend is, and I know it's hard also sometimes to imagine this, that even though no matter how many degrees you have, your education isn't over. As you go through your career over the next 50 years, as you think about changing jobs, you're going to need to top off your intellectual tank, almost like you would if your gas tank if you were driving across country. So you're going to need moments of education or of retraining to get ready for your next job, because there's no way what you learned in high school or college is going to be sufficient or relevant for what you might want to do in 10, 20, 30, or 40 years.
Richard, I mean, just truly inspirational and motivational words for our younger audience. And absolutely, I couldn't agree more. You have to continue to learn, always strive to learn, and always ask questions and want to learn, have that curiosity. And so speaking to that younger audience, what would be your call to action for them? What would you say is something that they could be doing now, during this global pandemic to better themselves or better society as a whole?
Well, the most important thing I would say is to realize that you should get involved, that there's no substitute for getting in there. You can make a difference. There's nothing inevitable about history. And I've been lucky enough, I've worked for 4 presidents, and I've been in rooms where decisions were made. And you realize if there were different people making those decisions, history would have gone in completely different directions. And the lesson I take from that is, get involved. Where you are now, there might be things you can do in your community. Maybe healthcare workers need help with homeschooling for their kids. There's things you can do now, given that our society is under tremendous pressure. But what you were getting at, John, is also it's a great time to tool up. Yeah. So if you're thinking about your next step as the economy recovers, maybe now is the time through distance learning to pick up that additional skill, whether it's a language, whether it's some computer skill. Maybe it's simply to get more up to speed about this part of the world or this set of issues. So if you're interested in global public health, look, we're at a moment in history where distance learning is not just possible, it's incredibly good. So it could be a formal course, it could simply be an informal sort of self-education thing, but use the time. I think it's, we're all in this weird life where every day is kind of blending into every other, and there's few boundaries between when you're working and when you're not. And there's a Groundhog Day quality to it. I get it. And all I would say is, introduce some structure into your life and basically say a few hours every day or whatever you can spare or devote. Here's my goal. If this lasts for another 6 months, which it might, or a year, or whatever it lasts, at the end of it, I want to have tooled up in a certain area. So be thinking about what interests you, or where you're weakest and where you need to build up, if you will. So then you're more employable, you're more ready for whatever it is you want to do next. But again, you can't choose the cards you're dealt. We've been dealt these cards. We're all living a life now that none of us ever imagined in our worst moments. Okay, here we are. So what do we make of it? And again, I would say if you've got the time, and a lot of us now have extra time, we're not commuting. Some of us are, 40 million Americans have lost their work. I would say devote as many of those hours as you can to tooling yourself up. So it might just be, reading or studying a language, gaining a skill. Also other things personal. Here's a great chance to do the musical or art exploration you always wanted to do. So there's any number of things. Plus, again, our society, our economy are in great need. And I would think that there's real opportunities to make a difference locally.
Yeah, and don't forget to pick up a copy of Richard Haas's book as well. I believe that's probably the best place that our global audience could start. It's available for e-read. I would be remiss not to mention that. And so, Richard, kind of in closing here, if our viewers want to find out more about your work in particular and the work of the council, where can they go?
Well, thank you for asking. For the council, it's cfr.org. It's an extraordinary site, by the way. Let me just sort of say, we curate the best that's written in the field. It's also a large educational dimension. We have something called World 101, and we're putting together an entire curriculum, all these online resources to teach people of the basics of the world, on globalization, on the regions of the world, on the history of the world, and so in many ways, parallel to the things I wrote about in the book. But CFR.org is an extraordinary site for people at any level of the field, from beginners to experts. Also, foreignaffairs.com, the Foreign Affairs website, is remarkable. And what we've done is, we've removed the paywall for anything about the coronavirus. So if you want to read what's going on and get a better understanding of the pandemic and its implications for your country or the world, it is all there. So I think those are extraordinary resources. And by the way, I'd say a lot of other newspapers and magazines have done the same thing, from the New York Times, from the Atlantic, and so forth. They've taken stuff that's normally behind paywalls and made it accessible. So the barriers to staying up on what's going on have come down in many cases.
Well, there you go. CFR and Foreign Affairs, The World, a brief introduction. It sounds like our audience has quite a lot of reading and quite a lot of places to look to get globally informed and involved. Richard Haas, President of the Council on Foreign Relations, we couldn't thank you enough this morning. Your insights were so impactful, and I think will really add a lot of value to our upcoming summit. So thank you so much, Richard. We greatly appreciate your time and participation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John. And thanks also to what you and your colleagues are doing. It's great to see so many people so involved in trying to improve the state of this world of ours. So thank you for that.
Absolutely.
It is our incredible honor and privilege today to have with us Sriram Visvanathan from IBM, Global Managing Director of Government, Healthcare, and Life Sciences, live from the UAE. Sriram, welcome.
George, great to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's just so incredible to have you on this program today to be talking about so many important issues, especially as it relates to the global issues that we're facing, including, of course, the pandemic. And I guess that's probably apropos to begin talking about that, because it's affecting everyone on this planet. to start with, could we talk a little bit about the impact on all of us as you see it? And what have you observed, Sriram, over the last 3 months? And what do you see as the longer term impact on the industries that you work with each and every day?
Well, George, it's the last 3 months have been have illustrated how fragile the world is, don't you think? It's been really incredible to observe how things that we took for granted every single day in our personal lives and in our professional lives are so fragile. Who would have thought supply chains could not cope with the requirements of the of our healthcare workers, right? That we were so unprepared for something in an era of big data. That's something that we've been talking about for years and years, and yet we we go back to basics and we say, okay, where is this disease? How is it going to progress? Why did it take so long for us to get ahead of it, right? Or even to the stage we are at. So I think my first observation is and reflection is how fragile the world is and how much we take for granted. I think technology has helped us in the immediate response to it. It's amazing, 60% of the workforce around the world are working remotely. And if anything, as we were talking about before the show, work seems to have accelerated. I talk with more clients today than when I was traveling 90% of my time. And we are able to do a lot more in a shortened period of time is how I feel. And whether it's remote work, whether it's supporting our healthcare industry, whether it's standing up additional compute power, whether it's using analytics and data to inform decision makers, to influence processes, to decide on resource allocation. We've been in the middle of all of that, right? And those are things that human beings have a tendency, to hunker down and to fight. But then I think we're coming to a stage where the next stage is about recovery and rebuild. And now you're starting to see a massive focus on what many people have termed the new normal. I would call it the new abnormal, because I think we are at least 12 months away from any kind of new normal. But for me, my reflections are some of the things that the UN Sustainable Development Goals talk about have come to light a lot more through this crisis. For instance, global inequality. You watch the news of migrant workers in India or in Africa rushing to return home. You look at things like the pandemic affecting certain segments of society a lot more. You look at global supply chains, urbanization is kind of reducing. You look at mass unemployment, 300 million around the world today. And you see the focus on trying to recover economies. So I think the impact on all of us, George, has just reiterated to me. I mean, of course, leave the technology side of it. I know we'll come and talk about innovation in a minute, but leave the technology side of it. For me, the big impact is the need for all of us in industry, in government, and professionals to focus on the UN 17 sustainable goals and to really make a dent, to innovate, to think differently about how we can address some of those issues.
Yeah, and just yesterday, I believe it was the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, came out and made an impassioned plea for that on the doubling down of helping to achieve the 17 broad goals of the United Nations. And as you know, Sriram, the 17 goals, were decided on perhaps the only time in the history of the UN where there was unanimity. Every single member, 193 member states, agreed on the broad framework, including the United States, on helping to achieve these broad goals. And what that says to me is it takes the politics out of the goals, which is a really fundamental component of helping to achieve them, quite frankly. And then you're able to just focus on what is the end game. You mentioned inequality. Certainly, according to so many reports from across the planet, there's been an acceleration or at least a highlight of the inequality that is present in certain areas. There's been an increased level of poverty and lack of education And I think what happens during a crisis like this is there's a light that shines down upon the areas that are most vulnerable, right? And we're seeing that today. And I think that's part of the story of what is the ability to do something transformational at this moment, to address these issues when the light is shining on them directly. When there's, they say sometimes in Washington, I'm sure you've heard this, sunshine is the best disinfectant. In this case, not exactly apropos, but you have a situation where the sunlight shining on an issue gives us an opportunity to understand it better and to help solve it quicker and just in a more comprehensive way. And I'd like to hear from you just quickly on, you mentioned the goals. Do you see what's happening as a setback, or do you see it as an accelerant? In other words, we were sitting in conversations like this in early January across the planet. People were convening, having conversations with 3,500 odd some days to 2030 with this runway to achieve the goals. And suddenly the world changed.
Yeah.
And suddenly you're in the UAE, I'm in Washington, D.C., but yet we're experiencing the same exact thing. Perhaps for the first time in human history, the entire planet is experiencing this, and with the speed of telecommunications and everything else, the awareness of the experience of others is also very, very clear. So are we closer to achieving the goals or further away as a result of what's happening?
I think we've got increased focus. My view is that, and we in industry can't allow that focus to go away, right? Again, a year hence, the danger is we all go back to business as usual. And what we need to do is to remember, this is one of the lessons, this is one of the gifts of this of this pandemic, is that it's brought to light, like I said, how fragile everything is. So if you look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, I think we all have an obligation to focus on how technology and innovation can help drive material change towards that goal, towards achieving some level of progress. I would say the last decade has demonstrated we haven't done that, right? I can take any of the goals. You look at aging population, by 2050, we're going to have 2 billion people around the world over 65. You look at 1% of the global population having 40% plus of the wealth. You look at 65 million people around the world migrating to cities, and yet, as we've experienced through the COVID-19 crisis, when jobs stop, when the jobs have gone from the cities, they're all rushing back to their homes and villages and trying to recover. You look at water scarcity, you look at food wastage. A third of all food that we produce is wasted. So for me, and you look at things like mental health, right? $16 trillion by 2030 is the economic impact of mental health. So some societal systemic issues, but underpinning all of that, technology can really make a difference. And for me, it's all about, the limiting factor is imagination. The limiting factor is personal ambition, in my view, towards achieving that. I hope that kind of addresses the question you raised, but I see it as an accelerant. I see it as an opportunity for us to really get to the root causes of some of these issues.
Sure, what an incredible insight into this issue, and looking at innovation and the impact of digital technology. Can you highlight the potential that you see for disruption? And how does this address, or how can it address, some of the biggest challenges that we see in society today?
Well, let's come at it from two sides, right, George? On the one hand, you have some critical technologies that are now more mature, more stable, that we can talk about forever. But I want to talk about how they can address the issue. So cloud, data, AI, open source, blockchain, quantum, 5G, all of those are relevant. It's what you do with them that's really going to make the difference, right? So let's take some examples. Education, for instance. just a small example, we opened something called a Pathways to Technology curriculum. This was our previous CEO's vision, P-Tech as it's called, in 2011. So far, 220 schools adopted the program, 150,000 students, 24 countries, 600 corporate partners. But this is open innovation of reinventing education, of allowing those underprivileged to solve a gap that we have in society, which is technical depth, security, what have you. In the new space, we don't have enough talent, right? So now we've just, a couple of months ago, in fact, we launched Open P-Tech. Now that's one example. I think education as an industry is going to go through transformation. We're going to see more partnerships. We're going to see collaboration. And my son is at university, he's a senior, and I'm not sure that I need to send my daughter for 4 years of undergrad studies, and that's the best thing for her. So as a parent, I wonder if there's a better way of learning. And I think I would hypothesize that in 20 years' time, the education system will go through reform. Think about, let's take another example. Let's think about, we talked about food wastage, right? How about using blockchain to really look at the supply chain? We're working with Yara, which is an agricultural, company that has a lot of insights. And we're using data analytics, geospatial information to help farmers get the best yield. But if you can connect that with technologies like blockchain to look at matching supply with demand and to look at how you can get food that's surplus to the people who need it the most. I'll give you another example. Post Hurricane Harvey, we looked at government stimulus funding, for the recovery effort. And we looked at using blockchain technology for one, data, AI, to look at how every dollar of that funding was being used, and did it have the impact it was intended for, because a lot of it does go waste around the world. And imagine if we could do that with charity organizations, where people like you and I who contribute to charity can have line of sight to how that money changed somebody's life, help somebody get educated, get the right medical help. I think we can have massive impact. So for me, I go back to the point I was making around, it's down to our imagination of how technology and innovation can reinvent some things that have been done the same way, but just perhaps digitized. Now we need to challenge how we can leverage insights and data to reimagine the whole thing. I don't know, George, does that make sense to you?
Well, Shriram, it makes a lot of sense. And I think the ability to reimagine, if you think about this for a moment, to reimagine entire sectors like education, just because something has been done a certain way for so much time or so many years, doesn't mean it's the most efficient way today. Healthcare is another great example of ripe for innovation and disruption. The delivery of healthcare, we are looking at a moment in time when your role actually becomes even exponentially more important, because you're helping to advise organizations, companies, et cetera, across the planet on how they can do things better, faster, cheaper, more efficiently. And I think that is paramount in what we're discussing here, because we were all on this giant treadmill of life in an accelerated fashion in January. I likened it to being on a slide. You're on a slide as a kid and you're moving so fast and everything's going by you. And we had to pause almost instantly.
Yeah.
It was an instant pause. It was like a big stop sign was held up and said, you cannot, you literally can go no further. And again, the planet went into this complete moment of stall. And now we're slowly, to your point, emerging out of this. But how do we then capture, this moment? How do we take this, just disruption, I'll refer to it as, with such an impact and loss of life, et cetera? Just tragic. and learn from it and move and become better. And how do we make, change happen faster? Shriram, how do we do that?
Well, a couple of things, right? And as a human being, as a member of society, as well as a professional who sees these stories play out all the time, I think we've looked at technology and we apply technology in very incremental fashions, especially in my industries, right? In the industries that I serve, it's always been incremental. Here's a process that we've done, put a system in to automate it, to digitize it. We haven't gone back to say, if the founding fathers had all of the wherewithal we have today, would they have designed the structures of government the same way as we have them today? I would argue that they wouldn't, right? And I would argue that they would be a lot more disruptive in designing things so that it's more productive, faster, more agile. So for me, it comes down to leadership. It comes down to the metrics that drive behavior. It comes down to people having the courage and conviction to say, this is not about the technology, but this is about the impact we can create. You can see examples of it all around the world. And I think, the COVID-19 crisis has made more people sit up and think and say, why did this happen? And how can we stop? And how can we contribute? And for me, the fundamental thing is around two things, and they're behavioral. They're not technological. You have a guy from IBM talking about technologies are given, but it's about leadership. It's asking the why question. It's collaborating. It's creating an environment for innovation at scale. It's flattening organizations. And this is the advice that I always give my clients, and this is the conversations I have around how are you creating an environment where you don't have this reporting layer where it's a pyramid, but you have a reporting layer, or you're creating an environment where ideas are welcome, mistakes are okay, you learn from them, you invent, you innovate, you move on, and technology, is available at scale to facilitate that. I mean, just look at how we are discussing things remotely. You wouldn't have thought this was possible 3 months ago.
That's right. That's right. And I think it is this pause is now presenting the ability to do exactly what you just described, is to reimagine and rethink and restructure as the opportunity. And I think leadership is critical. It starts, I believe, always it starts at the top, the ethos and just that tone. As I mentioned in my recent Forbes piece, tone is very important. And I believe that translates into action, or can translate into action. You work with governments, and I've worked in government as well, and it can be exhilarating, or it can be very, very frustrating when things either move too fast or oftentimes too slow. In this case, cloud. Governments seem to have been very slow to adopt cloud and AI and other technologies compared to what we see as the commercial sector. You've already shared some incredible insights on innovation and how innovation can address global challenges. But what do you see as the biggest obstacles in making this transformation a reality for governments?
Well, I think the cloud infrastructure around the world is getting better, stronger. There's more choice. We talk about hybrid cloud. We talk about not locking people into one particular cloud. At the end of the day, again, to my point earlier, I think the infrastructure and the platform and the ability to move applications and workloads to different clouds, all of that is available and can be implemented. I think it's really no longer an IT issue. It's a demand that needs to come from agencies that says, I want to be able to do A, B, and C faster more agile in sprints. And I'm no longer willing to wait for 12 months to implement a policy. Let's say there's a new benefit that a government wants to implement. Traditionally, that requirement would go to IT and would take forever to implement, right? And what is going to drive the adoption is the demand from agencies and businesses to get faster, more agile, and that's going to drive cloud adoption, in my view. And one of the factors that's actually going to make that happen is you've got more millennials coming into the workforce in government around the world. If you look at just Germany, for instance, a big percentage of government workforce are aging and will retire in the next decade, right? And as they retire, you're going to get a new set of workforce. You're going to get more automation, and you're going to get a new norm because they've lived in a digital world. So they're going to say, why can't I do what I do in my retail world in government? That's going to drive cloud adoption. So for me, that's what we need to do. And people in industry like IBM need to show that some of the traditional fears around data privacy and security and data residency, all of that can be handled. It can be handled. You can give people assurances and protect privacy and data rights and everything else. That's not. It's no longer an unsurmountable issue, right? It's more about opening people's mind to it, and that's where the secret sauce. That's the next hill we have to take.
Well, we've heard some absolutely incredible insights and perspectives from you today, Sriram, and I'd like to ask you one more question, just to give our global audience a little bit of insight into who you are and sort of your perspective and how you developed it. And so if we could go back to your first day at IBM, what did you find and how have things changed?
Oh, wow, that's an interesting question. I came, like many people who come into IBM, I came into IBM through an acquisition. I was part of Pricewaterhouse Consulting. And, it was like a kid coming into a candy store. I know it's an often used phrase, but when you're a management consultant throughout life, you provide recommendations to people as to what they have to do, what they can do, the art of the possible, but you don't have a hand in actually doing it and taking them through that journey. And companies like IBM give you that platform where you have the best of tech, you have great brains in different fields, whether it's quantum or cloud or the latest in terms of Unix servers or mainframes or security, you'll find somebody who has lived a life in that space. And so, like I said, it's like, being a kid in a candy store. And what I have learned, the experience for me has been the absolute, IBM has been a company that's worked from sending man to the moon to the biggest systems we've put in governments around the world. And we've constantly reinnovated ourselves. And we have an obligation to bring these new technologies like quantum, like AI, into the world in a responsible way, in a way that protects our clients' rights, that allows them to shape society for future generations. And that's what's most exciting about my day today. 20 years later, I'm still the same kid in a candy store at IBM, and I love it.
Well, that is a great way to conclude this interview. What last messages do you have for our global audience in countries all across the world? What would you say to them? How can they find out more about your work? There's so much work being done at IBM, but where would you begin to give them a parting message here?
Well, my parting message to people is it all starts with each one of us, right? I think the UN Sustainable Framework, the 17 goals, laid out, like you said, every country signed up to it. We all agreed on the goals. And it's a true North Star for me personally. And I constantly look at our strategy, look at our offerings, look at the work we are doing around the world and say, are we making an impact? Are we helping address this? But I think in a time of disruptive innovation, it comes down to the things we individually choose to do and the things we choose not to do. So I strive to be a lifelong learner. none of us have exclusive privilege and right to the greatest idea. And so leveraging the best ideas that come out from around the world and applying it to our situations matters to me. I think partnerships matter. And I think this creating this infectious culture of, perhaps the wrong phrase to use at this time, but creating an infectious culture of innovation for me matters. So I would ask each one of the audience to create that for their teams and for each other. And it's been a pleasure to be on your show, George, and I look forward to talking very, very soon.
Likewise, Sriram Viswanathan, Global Managing Director, Government, Healthcare, and Life Sciences at IBM, live from the UAE. We thank you so very much for your inspiration, for your shining light today during this time, and for your incredible leadership and innovation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ideagen TV, powered by Azure. We're so excited today to have with us Esteban Olivares from Summer Discovery. Esteban, welcome.
Thank you, George. Good to be here.
What an incredible moment in time to have you here with us on Ideagen TV. I know you have an incredible power panel on future global leaders with you today. And I wanted to say, my gosh, it seems like yesterday that we were sitting at the United Nations talking about this very issue of creating a future global leaders academy. And here we are today having launched the Future Global Leaders Academy together with Ideagen and Summer Discovery.
Yeah, we are excited about this new partnership and, the opportunity to, provide these leadership experiences for students and then to create those future leaders.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note, and I must note at the onset before you launch into your interview, that we'd like to applaud you and Summer Discovery for having that strategic foresight to pivot to online learning, to afford students across the planet literally the opportunity to continue learning, because after all, it's all about lifelong learning, and cultivating as well those future global leaders is so important. And in addition to that, I'd like to add that you have been a leader and a supporter of Ideagen and our mission to achieve those 17 broad global goals of the United Nations from the very beginning, Esteban. From the very beginning, you have been a supporter of helping in any way you can, and now through your role at Summer Discovery, to help achieve those broad global goals of the UN. By the way, unanimously agreed to by all 193 member states of the United Nations, including the United States of America. And so I applaud you for that. We're so excited and cannot wait to hear your incredible perspectives and insights, along with those of your guests today, to future global leaders.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you.
So today, for the summit, we have Jackie O'Hara, a student at UC Berkeley, and Vasikli Argyropoulos, a student at Vanderbilt. And let's jump right into the questions and get to know these two global leaders, youth leaders. So a question for each of you. Can you tell us about some of the issues, activities, and actions that you as future global leaders have addressed, with the pressing issues of the United Nations SDGs? So tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of tell us about some of those actions and initiatives that you're working on. Jackie, you want to start?
Yeah, that sounds great. Hi, I'm Jackie. It's been quite an interesting last few months, and a lot of the things I've been doing has pivoted towards online learning. So currently I'm working with Eisenhower Fellowships to promote women in STEM and improve diversity in male-dominated fields. And so that has been my big initiative for the most part. So I was really excited to work with my community to found Academic Pipeline. It is an online supplemental learning program that is free for all students. We're even collecting donations so we can help low-income students with technological deficiencies. And so that has been our biggest shift so far during this pandemic. But in terms of just what we've all been doing is not only online supplemental learning, but also with my work at Berkeley, we've been working to support women who have been financially burdened over the pandemic by providing free menstrual products and sanitary products for them. So their burden doesn't have to, choose between menstrual products and food on the table for them or their loved ones. And so those are kind of some of the things we've been working on right now. And I'm super excited to continue those goals. And those are really big pillars for the UN, right? Which is gender equity, sanitation initiatives, as well as, academic and educational opportunity.
Well, that's wonderful to hear.
Sounds perfect. So as Jackie said, I also have been involved with education technology during this period of COVID. So I actually decided to hop on board and help out a startup in the ed tech field that actually originally started doing blended learning in Korea. And now they're actually trying to pivot and trying to make the charter school system a lot more accessible and able to have that blended learning path moving forward in the future, which, education as we know it is going to be completely changed. COVID's going to be a catalyst for a lot of, education technology startups and different businesses and avenues. And another thing I'm doing, I actually started my own nonprofit a little bit back in the day. And what we do is we take old and used cell phones and recycle them for money. And then with that money, we buy orphans and foster home children toys. But we decided to do a bit of a pivot during COVID, and we're actually helping with sanitation in New York. We're actually producing masks and sending them out in mass quantities out to New York to help them out with everything that's going on now. So definitely pressing times, and it's making us think about how this is going to change our life drastically.
Wow. Both of you are just doing some amazing things, empowering women, sanitation, education, all very important things in upholding the SDGs and meeting those goals by 2030. So when we're talking about youth, and it seems that both of you are working with youth as well, what are some of the concerns that need to be addressed in achieving the SDGs, specifically with respect to global innovation, but also other relevant goals and addressing youth?
Yeah, I could take this one since I was second last time and just switch off. But couple things that I've noticed is, on the education piece, I think accessibility with online learning is going to be something that we really need to conquer. One would think that online learning makes things more accessible, which it does. However, a lot of times with, maybe kindergarten kids or kids that are younger, they need some sort of adult or some sort of learning coach. That's what a lot of people have been calling it these days, in order to help them aid their learning at home and in these online settings. So if we can figure out somehow how to kind of remove that aspect of it, I think it would be a lot more accessible, because not everyone has that older member, that parent that can help them actually achieve online learning to its full capacity. That being said, I also think, sanitation is pretty much just a immediate need for right now, and obviously like taking those best practices moving forward. But that's kind of one of the big issues I see, is the accessibility, which is pretty counterintuitive.
Yeah, I agree. Those are some really big issues. Accessibility is, something that we're still trying to find ways. And I think it just shows how important it is that we create, a diverse team of, fields and perspectives, because, it's difficult when you have a homogeneous community that is trying to create access for everyone. we end up finding that it leads to unintentional bias, which we're seeing in a lot of the AI and programs that are being currently used now, and that are going to be further developed with this push to online learning. And so it's really important that now more than ever, we really work to enhance the diversity and opportunity for women and minorities to, get a seat at the table. So I think that is a huge thing. And I think, all of these goals are interconnected in some fundamental way, right? You can't have opportunities without economic advancements. You can't have economic advancements without some form of sanitation and some form of infrastructure and agricultural security. And, so they are all interconnected, which is why it's sometimes really difficult to pick one thing or a few things that are most important to focus on. But for the most part, I think something that's really fundamental to all of these goals is education and is, economic empowerment of diverse groups. And so those are some of the things that we've been working on specifically because those will, cascade and have a domino effect on all the other goals, in my opinion. And so those are some really fundamental ones to me.
Thank you. And as we know, that the goals, they're big, they're worldwide, they're global. And I think sometimes there's misconceptions about the role that youth can play in helping design that framework to meet the goals. And so what's your perception on some common misconceptions that may be out there of the role that youth can play?
So I think the biggest misconception is they're too young, they don't know enough, leave it to the adults. And I understand where people get those from, right? We have this societal perception of, kids just should be kids, and that's fine. But, kids are passionate. They love learning. They're curious and, they're learning right from wrong in such a young age. And, they want to build on that and build things and, help people. And I don't think we should ever put obstacles in kids' ways to, do those things. And if anything, we should be building bridges for them, connecting them with people and mentors that, are only just going to further this, love for their community and this passion of theirs. And so I think that is, fundamental.
I definitely agree with that statement. I think that there's maybe sometimes unconscious or conscious biases towards kids thinking that they're not capable. I know I first started my first entrepreneurial venture actually in middle school, and I, something in my head was like, I can do this. I have full capacity to do this. And I think, that's contrary to what society teaches you as a young kid. And I don't think we should ever cap people's potential or ever, cap their aspirations, even if it is traditionally too young. I think we should encourage them and, like Jackie said, lead them to mentors. And honestly, I actually think that leading kids towards, engineering at a young age can be really important in creating innovation down the line. And, there's been a recent call to build and have like our education focus on building. And I'm a computer science minor, and I feel that even an understanding of technology or engineering ingrained in young kids can help us all build and actually create things that can make society better as a whole.
Thank you for those insights. I think it's agree with you. It's very important that we empower youth. With Summer Discovery and Ideagen, we're focusing on this Future Global Leaders program, to provide the tools for youth to learn about the SDGs, how to raise awareness, and to come up with solutions to real world problems. So that cross-sector collaboration, we're committed to providing that opportunity with Ideagen. Do you have any suggestions or ideas for leaders in education or leaders in social innovation and technology? What more can we do to empower youth, and especially providing the tools that they need to become future leaders?
Definitely. So I actually think we should use technology and online education as a strength. So I think there's a common misconception of how do we get what we're doing in person onto online? Well, I think we should be looking at it as how do we make online better than what we can do in person? And I think that small little shift is so important. And I think that this could be amazing. Like we could have, a public school system in, Maryland, which is where I'm originally from, and a public school system in California collab over the internet, and that increases diversity, that increases conversation, people in different neighborhoods or different areas, which formerly in the brick and mortar type sense has been focused on location, but now location is boundless, so we can understand someone from a completely different country or a completely different city than us. And I think that would be something cool to jump on and really explore in education moving forward.
Yeah, I love that point. I really think the internet has the power to, connect us all and create a wonderful network for young students, especially to, meet people, be inspired, learn, become culturally aware of, just the place that they're living in and other places. And so that's an excellent point. I think, some of the biggest things would be empowering young students in these fields with growth mindsets, showing them that, they can take it, like Vasily said, one step forward and, it really improve on what we have now. There's so much that we can, build constructively with the power of AI and the internet and, online learning. And I don't think that, we're ever going to go back anytime soon. I think we have so many people that are working to implement wonderful programs that are really going to enhance learning, allow students to learn at their own pace, which I think is something that brick and mortar schools have been struggling to promote ever since, time began. So it's going to be really interesting to see how educators are going to shift in this time, as opposed to, coming back. I think, online learning is going to be really, really interesting in the future, and I'm excited to see where it goes from here.
Totally agree with both of your statements. I think the online learning and kind of video conferencing with professors, or working on a group project with somebody from Asia and somebody from South America who's working with a student on the East Coast in the U.S. Those are just amazing opportunities that we're just not always able to do, in the brick and mortar. And it's real time, and we're looking at solving real world problems, and we can use technology, to kind of level that playing field, but at the same time, encourage instructors and educators to, do some dynamic, learning and using that technology to, provide those dynamic experiences. Definitely, as we are looking at what needs to be addressed. Is there anything that you think we're kind of leaving out of the discussion when it comes to innovation and youth?
I can name a few. I think socioeconomic disparity means that the people leading this education and online and drive, right, all the programs and different measures, right, that we're implementing is made by people who, is not as diverse as we would like to see. And I think, that has a lot to do with the economic situation of our country, how spread out it is, as well as, gender equity issues, right, where we see very few women in STEM fields, especially in coding and computer science, and the fields that are really taking off right now and are going to be really fundamental to the future of, how online learning is going to be and how all of these, internet programs are going to start coming about. And so really empowering these people to get a seat at the table, become, change makers, and, really get the whole of our country and, our world a voice and equally, equitably, accessibly involved in this transition that we're all experiencing during this pandemic is so important. I just cannot understate it. You know, really bringing out how we as a community can empower one another through AI and internet, right? Like, we have so much power to share here, right? It's not about slicing the pie, it's about making the pie bigger. And we have that opportunity here right now. This internet is such a way to level out disparities across the field if we do it right and if we, you know, pay attention to these things. And so that is something that, you know, we really do have to be mindful of. We have to be mindful of who's running these programs, who's creating these programs. Are they ethically sound? Is the data they're using sourced ethically with consent? Do people understand what's going on when their data is being used and analyzed and turned into code? Things like that are just so important. And I really want to see how it goes in the future.
Yeah, I agree with everything Jackie just said. But to continue on, I actually think that something, you know, a really big problem that I've seen recently is that society, or just in general, is society puts people into boxes, and you're almost kind of pivoted against the other box. And, you know, society can be very competitive, which, you know, at the same time could have some good aspects. But like, let's say, like, even with political parties, you know, like, if you're fully one party versus another, then, you know, that causes a lot of hate. And I think that if we can get across these, you know, hateful boxes or these lines and just kind of all come together and look at a person not based on their gender or race or political thoughts, and just look at them as like their individual person, and, you know, the personality and character and things.
So I definitely agree that, you know, it's going to be a great equalizer, providing these online learning opportunities, and really how we choose to use that technology is going to be very important. For one of the experiences in the Summer Discovery Online program, where students enrolled in the Ideagen Future Global Leaders Academy, they'll also be able to, you know, engage in some outside activities. And one speaker series that we're excited about is the future of work, and we want to bring in folks from technology and tech to talk about what, you know, impacts AI, machine learning will have on the future of work, regardless of what field you're in. So I think, you know, you're hitting the vein, and definitely we're excited about things this summer. You know, so as students are kind of thinking about what do I do for summer, and maybe they're looking at the Ideagen Future Global Leaders Academy website, and, you know, they find out that they can, you know, learn about the SDGs, they can raise awareness, they can, you know, get the tools to develop their own action plans. What words of advice do you have for those future leaders who are, you know, they haven't done an action in the past, or they haven't done an awareness campaign? You know, they're going to learn those skills in the academy. Do you have any words of advice for them?
Yeah, I think, you know, starting something can, you know, ultimately be intimidating, especially at such a young age. And it's all about resilience and grit. And if you are passionate, then you shouldn't let anything or anyone stop you. You know, there's no such thing as ever doing too much to help, you know, your community. And I just hope that they all can, you know, look up to all the amazing people in Ideagen, this program, and see how many people are out there ready to root for them. And I'm ready to root for you. Mentorship is so important. And I promise you all, you upcoming leaders, you're going to do great things. You just have to keep going. And even when it's hard, even when there's obstacles, have that growth mindset to succeed, and ask for help when you need it, and do your best. And that's all anyone can ever ask of you. So good luck, everyone.
Yeah, good luck to all the future leaders. I say, just be a doer. Just go out there and, things may be uncertain. Things might not always work out, but just keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And, one day it's going to break through. And I also would suggest that, becoming accustomed with uncertainty is really important just in life in general, because, in school, you probably always have an answer sheet. There's always something to check your work on. But in real life and, in entrepreneurship, or if you're building a campaign or whatever, you essentially won't have that. And sometimes solving problems takes years, and you just have to kind of keep pushing through. I also think that know your motivation. So kind of take time to journal and think internally what motivates you. And for everyone, that's something different. But once you have that anchoring, nothing can stop you. And that's like an internal confidence and something internal that will never change, and it will drive you forward to success and beyond.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you, Jackie and Vasily. We're definitely going to have to figure out a way to have you come and talk with our students. We can definitely leverage technology and bring you into the classroom. I think that's one of the amazing things. So we should definitely talk offline about that.
Perfect. Yeah.
Would be honored. So excited.
So I just want to remind everyone that the Future Global Leaders Academy, the first session is June 29th. And there's information on Ideagen's website. You can also find information on the Summer Discovery website. And we encourage folks to call in, apply, and be part of this amazing initiative. Thank you.
Welcome, Stephen James Tingus, to the Global Innovation 2030 Digital Summit. Here at Ideagen, we are so honored to have you, and I'm really pleased to be interviewing you today, Stephen.
Thank you.
It is great to have you here. So I'm going to dive right into it. You recently finished up your first episode of your new series, Ideagen TV, guest hosted with Stephen James Tingus. Your first two inaugural guests were Viola Davis and her husband, Julius Tinnen. For those who may have missed it, can you tell our global audience a little bit about the interview and just what was discussed?
Right. Well, Julius are very good friends of mine. The purpose of the inaugural interview was to talk about where we are as far as diversity and inclusion in Hollywood, and talking about the statistics, where we are as far as hiring of talent behind and in front of the camera, and obviously a little bit about disability inclusion. It's a very informative segment that we did through Ideagen, and it was just really an honest discussion about race, disability, and the business sense of inclusion here in Hollywood.
Yeah, and I know you've been a huge advocate for disability inclusion across all sectors, not just, in Hollywood and your work in the past. Can you tell our global audience a little bit about what it's like for those that are underrepresented in, let's say, Hollywood?
It's really hard, and a little bit I'd be remiss in not saying a little bit disappointing that based on the demographics of America, we're still not, people with disabilities and other races are still not represented in many industries, whether it be business, corporate, whether it be Hollywood, whether it be in elected office. I mean, definitely in elected office. But, you know, we all try to do the best that we can do to make sure that people who are not close to the disability community to understand what it's like to live with a disability and the misperceptions about our actual abilities. So a lot of work still needs to be done, but fortunately, me and other leaders in disability are making a very big effort to improve that. And there's about 20% of Americans have a disability, yet only about 2% are included in America with regard to employment opportunities. I would say opportunities at a senior level.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. You talk a lot about the misconceptions and how to get those included in a operational and management level. What steps or actions, in your opinion, do you think we need to take to fix these issues?
I think we need, in a policy perspective, we need to give businesses more incentive financially, whether it be tax write-offs or other opportunities to employ people with disabilities. And I'm not just talking about entry-level jobs, although entry-level jobs are very important for those with, intellectual disabilities,
sure, yeah.
and other disabilities that need to be employed to be self-independent. And then there's people like myself that are educated and trained for executive level positions. So I think we really need to do a better job as a country, giving the right incentives to large businesses and corporations to hire. And then I think we need to do a better job through PSAs to really educate people about disability, as we do for the senior population. You see a lot of ads on TV or PSAs about seniors, but you really don't see anything about people with disabilities. However, companies like Target and other companies, Microsoft, are including people with disabilities in their advertising. So I think we're making an improvement, but we need to really give large corporations incentives to be involved.
I mean, that's still inspiring for me to hear that, you think that we're taking steps forward at least, instead of being at a standstill or even regressing into something worse. So,
right.
That is some good news to take out of it.
Yes.
To kind of switch gears a little bit, as we're on the runway to 2030 and we head into achieving the 17 global goals that we always talk about here, have you found a decrease in those that are underrepresented in Hollywood or an increase and what you might think that is.
Right. My most important goal for 2030 is goal number 10, reducing inequalities. And in Hollywood, for the past, I would say, 5 years, you've seen an increase in the representation of talent. I would say, there's behind the camera and there's in front of the camera. Let me be honest, I really don't see a lot of people with visible disabilities at the corporate level here in Hollywood. However, you've seen it increase from about 1% to about 2.5% of people, talent, for a better word, in front of the camera. And a lot of my friends in Hollywood are actors and directors and writers, mostly actors. And I do act when the opportunity presents itself on TV and in music videos and independent films. But again, my focus is on the business side of inclusion. So we have seen about a 1% increase in the participation rate for people with disabilities. But again, we represent 20% of America. And I think for all communities underrepresented, our target needs to be with regard to the demographic breakdown. So I want to see people with disabilities that are talented increase from 2% to close to 20%, because America wants to see itself on screen and on TV.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of brings me to another point. You mentioned that you're seeing a slight increase, at least, in actors and entertainers with disabilities. Do you think that you're seeing any increase in the kind of managerial business side of it, or is it just stale or decreasing?
No, I don't think it's decreasing, and I don't think it's increasing. I've been helping NBC Universal and their leadership think about ideas for increasing the participation rate. Obviously, I'm advising Viola Davis and Julius Tennant at Juvie Productions about increasing the storyline development and casting for their projects. And I'm also going to be advising people like Emmy Award winning director Norman Lear, who is a good friend of mine for many years, and Kate Fulp of the USC Edinburgh Norman Lear Center. They advise all the writers with regard to various topics, including disability. So it's going to take leaders like myself and other of my peers in Hollywood to really educate, rather than, I like to advocate and educate on the business side, because when you go into a corporate room, the table, you really need to have your facts and figures and the business economic incentive for inclusion. And if you don't have that, you really can't sell the issue. So it's all about,
You have to be able to support it. That makes total sense.
yeah, talent is great. And we have a lot of good talent for Hollywood. But again, it's all about the business of the business.
Yeah, sure. So to back it up just a little bit, you mentioned your last episode that you had with Viola and Julius, and I
Yes.
was a huge fan. That was an amazing interview. Without
Thank
giving
you.
too much away, could you share a little bit about your upcoming show and your new hit series with Ideagen TV?
Yes. At the end of the month, we will be filming an interview with the USC Annenberg Norbert Lear Center, specifically with Kate Fulm and hopefully with Norbert Lear himself, to
Wow.
talk about the work that they're doing with regard to educating and helping screenwriters better represent, whether it be people with disabilities, whether it be seniors, whether it be about HIV, AIDS, whether it be, about mental health. We're going to talk about the importance of authentic representation in the screenwriting process itself. And I've been supporting their center for, I think, since 2014. And they are a remarkable group of individuals that really help express what's going on in America for TV and film.
Wow, that's going to be great. I'm a huge fan of Norman Lear, and I'm excited to see that. That would be amazing. And I think that your interviews, at least with Viola and Julius, had a lot more intimate and personal touch to it. So it's kind of refreshing to see celebrities just sit down and
Right.
and talk to just regular people.
Right. The purpose of Ideagen TV Hollywood is to work with some of my good friends in Hollywood that are actually able to move the needle on inclusion. So these are meant to be very open, authentic discussions on the good and the bad side of the industry and how we can make it better so that everybody in America can see themselves in TV shows and movies.
Yeah, that's so real. It's really nice. So thanks for joining us today, Stephen. You've been great as always. You're just as good an interviewee as you are an interviewer. As we conclude, do you have any call to action for our global audience as we head down the runway to 2030?
Yes, let's keep in the back of our mind that we are all going through an enormous change in America. I remember the civil rights era in '68. We need to make sure that we support one another. We need to have a better understanding of the struggles that we all go through. And we need to really love one another more now than ever to make long-lasting positive change.
Yeah, couldn't have said it better myself. That's poetic, truly. Stephen, thanks so much for taking the time out of your day to talk to me for a little bit. It's been an honor.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
All right.
Welcome back to Ideagen TV. We're so excited today to have with us an incredible panel led by the moderator, BJ Moore, Executive Vice President and CIO at Providence St. Joseph Health. BJ, welcome.
Thank you, George. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and do our power panel today. Just quickly wanted to give you some background on Providence before I introduce the other panelists. So Providence is one of the largest health systems here in the United States. We're basically here on the West Coast and in 7 states, 51 hospitals, over 1,000 clinics. We're $25 billion in revenue, 165-year-old company formed by women, something we're very proud of, over 120,000 employees. So big and have some big breadth and impact here in the US and healthcare. Our other claim to fame here with COVID is we actually had the first COVID patient here in the United States. So I have a very unique perspective on that. And today I'm joined by 3 of my colleagues. I'm going to go ahead and allow them to introduce themselves, and then we'll jump into the panel. So Amy, maybe start with you.
Sure. I'm Dr. Amy Compton Phillips. I'm an internist and the Chief Clinical Officer here at Providence. Been an internist since 1990, so came of age in the last, when HIV and AIDS was the biggest pandemic around. And we just got these newfangled things in our offices, these desktop computers. And so have been following the trajectory of not only infectious disease and pandemics, but also the advent of computers, automation, AI, and digital technologies over the past several decades.
Great. Thank you, Amy. Michael?
Yeah, hi, I'm Michael Larson, CEO of Quivic, which is a subsidiary of Providence. We build predictive analytics tools for hospital operations. The team at Quivic, myself included, are data scientists. We come from a variety of backgrounds, folks who've been in transportation, manufacturing, technology. Myself, I come from retail, spent a number of years at Amazon. I'm excited to be part of the panel.
Great, thank you. And Ari.
Hey folks, Ari Robichek. I'm the Chief Medical Analytics Officer here at Providence. I am an infectious disease doctor and hospital epidemiologist by background, and fell into the world of data while I was chasing antibiotic-resistant organisms and populations in Chicago. And I'm lucky to head up a group that thinks about ways that we can use data at Providence to help improve the way we provide care.
Great, thank you, Ari. So let's go ahead and jump into it. Amy, I'll start with you. Have all of the panelists answer this question. So I mentioned in the introduction, we're at the epicenter, the beginning of the COVID crisis here. What has that experience been like, Amy?
Well, that's a really big question, BJ. What has that experience been like? Like, what's your life been like? So it was a transformative experience, to be honest with you. So we got our first patient, as you mentioned, in the US at the end of January, and we recognized right off, we'd been watching this in the periphery in China, and we knew that there was real risk of a pandemic happening with a respiratory spread novel pathogen. And so knowing that, the day we got the first patient in, we activated the response we'd built in preparation for Ebola, right? We'd been building things in the background. What happens just in case? And so we turned that all on. We put infrastructure in place to make sure that any patient who came in with cough, fever, shortness of breath was identified for any risk for COVID, for example. And we did that across all 20,000 physicians that exist in our system, and we made sure that we had the tools and capabilities available. We also, working with Dr. Robichek, built a data infrastructure so that we could understand what we were seeing and learn from it very rapidly. We started having huddles so that we could surface information that happened somewhere and get it across all 7 states and across 1,000 medical offices and 51 hospitals. And so we really set up a very robust learning system rapidly so we could figure out what on earth to do with this otherwise unknown germ.
Yeah, and Amy, I want to call out, you had set up the early morning huddles. So all of the executives here at Providence St. Joseph Health every morning at 7:30 would get together. Amy drove that, make sure we're all on the same page, understood where the challenges were, where we needed to accelerate, where we maybe could decelerate. So your leadership has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you, Amy. Ari, I'm actually going to jump to you because I know you were kind of the data analytics behind all of that. What was your experience like?
It was an interesting and terrifying time. It's not that often in your career when you encounter a situation where you know so little about what you're dealing with and where the need for information is so incredibly great. So as Amy said, a lot of what my team working together with your team was doing was figuring out how do we pull all the data in one place. And part of what was challenging about it was we had new questions every day. Initially we were trying to answer the question, do we have COVID in the United States? Then we were trying to answer questions like, do we have personal protective equipment to handle the number of patients that we have? And then we were immediately asking ourselves the question, well, how many patients are we going to have? And all of these were questions that were different than the sort of questions that we're used to answering. There still are so many unanswered questions about this virus. What's the best way to treat it? How long do symptoms last? What's the safest way to reopen? How dangerous is it for care providers when they're looking after COVID patients? And on and on. And so I don't think I've ever been at a point in my career of chasing down information when it's been so essential to have a good infrastructure for rapidly answering questions as they arise. So it's been a very exciting and challenging and rewarding time.
Yeah. And what I liked is that data allowed us to be data driven. Like you said early on, what were the challenges? Did we have the protective equipment? Did we have the beds? Did we have the ventilators? But you also in parallel did the modeling, right? And projection. And I know in the beginning, those projections were pretty, right? The models hadn't been tested. How do you feel about those predictive models now? I know that we met this morning and the predictive models feel like they're doing pretty well. What's your assessment of those predictive models?
Well, they've gotten a heck of a lot more sophisticated, and I would say that one of the great leaps forward was actually having Quivik, so Mike Larson's team, become involved in the modeling process. And I'll just say that we evolved from kind of small homegrown models run off of my desktop to an approach where we started thinking about both more sophisticated modeling methods, but also starting to think in a more sophisticated way about what are the data sources that we could bring to bear. And what I showed this morning was actually the output of 4 different models that competed with each other and can all be used in our decision-making process. And we're actually in the process of building even more models. But I don't know, Michael, maybe you're best to talk about this.
Great.
Your team is doing a lot of heavy lifting.
No, I echo Amy and Ari's comments. One thing I would add is, there's a wealth of literature out there that has dealt with epidemiological modeling for many, many years. One of the real challenges is thinking about not only are these models directly applicable to the scenarios we're seeing, but how does it impact Providence specifically? And I think when we talk more generally about modeling, one of the real challenges is, it's one thing to build a model or a solution for an average hospital, but to start to think about how you build solutions that are going to be robust and extendable across a breadth of systems is a real challenge, especially when things on the ground are changing, when data is in many cases hard to come by, but you start to learn more about these situations, and to Ari's point, you start to think about other data sources that might be indicative and provide valuable clues into finding productive solutions. It's really been a collaborative effort. I mean, I think you can talk about the data science, but it really is bringing together the folks who are the clinicians, the folks who have expertise with the operational side, the managers on the ground. It's really a team effort.
And it's worth just throwing out to give the audience a sense of the span of different data types that are in the process of being actively used or going into the predictions that the Quivik team is making. It started out with basically just our internal data. So how many patients are in house today, because that's what we're ultimately trying to predict for a few weeks in advance. But then we started looking at things like, can we look at our test data? So testing on symptomatic patients in a particular geographical region, testing on asymptomatic patients in that same region. How busy are emergency departments? What's happening in terms of syndromic surveillance? So in the community that's the catchment of a particular hospital, what symptoms are people complaining to their clinicians about? And then we started realizing there's a lot of what we're calling exogenous data as well. Google and Facebook and various other groups that collect cell phone movement data have all made data freely available that can be used for prediction purposes. So we're evaluating all of those right now.
Which is exactly right. But I think one of the things that was really, really interesting about February and March is these guys are talking about using the data to make predictions. We had no data, we had no predictions, and we were going, this is what we think we have to do based on what happened in 1918. We were literally looking back for data that happened 100 years ago to predict what might happen today. And so in a field that has done a lot over the past 20, 30 years to become very much data evidence driven, it was uncomfortable for a lot of us saying, we're going to have to use judgment here because the data simply doesn't exist. And so it was an odd juxtaposition moment in a world that's getting ever more data driven. We had to use logic to make some assumptions.
What I appreciate in those early days is we had focus as an executive team. Not having the data, what I've seen, the trap that tech companies fall into is they try to chase 1,000 ideas at once. And I really appreciated that we were focused on the vital few, trying to answer those immediate questions. Did we have enough beds? Did we have enough ventilators? Those things, instead of, trying to boil the ocean. Certainly we've gotten more complex since then, but the focus that you provided, Amy, up front was fantastic. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next question. Next question is really around the acceleration and adoption of technology. The statistics I've been throwing out is, over an 8-week period, we did at least 8 months of work. I would say even 2 or 3 years worth of work. The acceleration that we saw in the adoption of tools and technology and things that we did that would have taken months or years was unprecedented. Love to hear from you on how you feel like that technology really changed the way we approached this crisis. So, Michael, I'm going to start with you. Put you on the spot.
Excellent. Appreciate it. I think Amy made a good point just a few minutes ago about the fact that, especially early on, we had to rely so much on judgment. But part of what's happened since then is as you learn more, it's a very adaptive process. So it's an extremely iterative process. And so as more data becomes available, as you have more information, these models are really living models. And being able to balance the decision making with the accuracy or lack of accuracy in these models has been a real challenge. But it's something that that you're trying to talk about the speed here at which this situation has evolved. It literally has gone from a situation where you had essentially no data to something where you now have multiple models out in the industry, and people talk about different ways of thinking about this. You can start to Ari's point, you start to have multiple models that you're starting to evaluate simultaneously. So it's been a very rapid evolution. I've seen, in other industries, in the retail industry, for example, the way in which Amazon went about building its infrastructure. There were certainly crises and fire drills you deal with during the holiday season when you're kind of at the peak. This reminded me in many ways of that, but even more so, the fact that time-sensitive nature of the modeling was absolutely critical here.
Yeah, necessity is absolutely the mother of invention. And Amy, when I said that we did things in 8 weeks that would normally take 8 months or even years, I saw your body language said you agree. Do you agree with that statement? Am I overstating kind of the pace that we were able to deploy and adopt new technology?
You did not. You didn't overstate it at all, BJ. And I think back to what you said initially is that it was a very deliberate decision. And we basically, back to first principles, okay, we're going to have patients who need our help and we're not going to have capacity to help them. So what do we do about it? And we divided it up into 3 big areas, because we have to figure out how to triage patients, just like you would in a war, right? Like, who do you have to help? Where? How? Where do you get people to the right venue of care? And so we set up something called a chatbot that we'd never done before, but it's an automated tool that if you Googled on, do I have COVID or do I have coronavirus? It would take you into this little algorithm that you answer questions and then helps you decide what you need to do next. And then that would automatically send you over to an option to do an Express Care virtual, so a virtual visit online. And we went from having less than 50 a day to, at our peak, doing about 1,500 a day over the course of just a couple of weeks. So we allowed patients to get virtual care at the click of a button. And then figure out who needed to get testing, because as you know, even now we still have limitations in testing. And so we had to pick and choose who got tests, and the people who most likely had the appropriate symptoms, we sent in to get tested through a drive-through test, another big thing we never would have been able to set up, even with our EMR, our electronic medical record. We couldn't set that up, right? And so your team was out there setting up iPad-based drive-through testing centers, in the middle of this pandemic. And then treatment. We had to figure out, how do we treat patients if all the hospital beds are full? And so we set up a way to send patients that we thought were okay but at risk home with things like a pulse oximeter to measure their oxygen levels and a thermometer, and then check in with them on a regular basis at home. So we didn't have to admit every person who we thought was a high-risk patient into the hospital, and instead could care through them virtually at home. And by using all that tech infrastructure, we were able to really care for patients where they wanted to get care, but do it in a way that was very safe. And our outcomes have shown that we did it pretty well. So, and that was all technology based.
I just want to make a quick plug there. Hopefully it's not self-serving, but normally when you do something so quick, it's bubble gum and baling wire, and maybe it's not a durable solution. The beautiful thing is, I think everything we produce really is durable. When the pandemic is over, the telehealth, infrastructure that we built is going to be durable. The change management of people being careful, comfortable of doing healthcare from home, sending patients home and being able to monitor them, I think that's going to be durable. So not only did we move quickly, but they're durable assets that change the way we deliver care.
Yeah, can I just pile on that one moment? Is that it shows that the barrier to adoption in the past wasn't the technology, it wasn't the doctors, it wasn't the workflows, it was the reimbursement system. It wasn't in contracts, and patients didn't use it because they thought it would, pay more. And so the fact that barrier disappeared instantly allowed it to scale. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, one other thing to add around a year of work in 8 weeks and sort of progress that's going to be durable is the infrastructure that's been developing around research in our organization. Encountering a novel disease, didn't know how to handle it. There's just a ton that needs to be figured out. And we've had this great group of researchers come together, including clinical trialists and health services researchers who've been studying a huge range of different things about this virus, including what's the best way to treat it. So we've learned a lot about hydroxychloroquine, about remdesivir. We've seen huge changes in clinical practice on the ground. We went from intubating 25% of patients to more like 10 or 11% of patients now, and we've seen improvements in our mortality rate over time inside our hospitals. So we're learning, how to treat. We're learning how to triage. We're learning how to figure out how to do infection control optimally. We're learning, as you've been describing, how best to make sure patients are cared for in the optimal setting. So there's a ton of learning, and much of this is now being done in a scholarly way, which I think is.
Yeah, I just want to call out, or I should have mentioned earlier, I was at Microsoft for 25 years, and that's a very specific environment where you don't necessarily collaborate. You don't collaborate with competitors. I really love to see how the World Health Organizations pull together, right? Not only other health systems here in the US, but how we were reaching out to researchers and hospital systems in other countries and really building those best practices. And then all those best practices were being, rolled into the way we treated patients or built our models or ran our systems. And so the way the whole world pulled together on this was truly impressive. And coming from tech, that was something new to me. In tech, we don't do things like that. So it's a great segue, if you don't mind. And Ari, I'll start with you. We talked about these models and how it's helped us during this kind of phase of the crisis. What do you think about the next phase and the potential surge that we're talking about in the fall? Do you think these assets can really help us then, or do you think it's again uncharted waters?
I think we're going to be a lot better prepared for the fall than we were for this time around. I think we've built a lot of valuable and durable infrastructure, as we've talked about. That there will continue to be sort of mysteries that will need to be solved as we go. But just to give you some specific examples, I believe that the surge modeling that Michael and team have been doing is enormously growing in sophistication and is now going from just the question of like, what's the shape of that initial curve going to look like, to helping us figure out what's going on in a hyper-local space, which is, I think, incredibly relevant now as we're seeing some of our communities with considerably more disease activity than others, and finding that we've got to make very specific, calibrated decisions about how to optimally provide care in different communities. Another thing that we've been working on is, for example, predictive modeling. And so we've developed a model that's designed to help with emergency department triage, one of the trickier elements of this. So a patient shows up to the ED with shortness of breath and cough and fever, and you think they've probably got COVID. Are they safe to send home? In many cases, yes, but in some cases, no. How do you know? And so we've used machine learning tools to actually process the data on some 39,000 patients whom we've evaluated for COVID in our emergency departments, on whom we have downstream data about what their outcomes were. And we're in the process now of building an implementable tool that will be available, we hope, in the fall, if we have a surge again for decision making. Speaking of collaboration, we've been collaborating with an AI group at Berkeley and a computer vision group at MIT to see whether it's possible to use a patient's presenting chest x-ray in the emergency department to predict whether or not they're one of the patients who's going to suffer that sudden respiratory deterioration a few days later. So yes, I think there are a lot of tools that we're in the process, that we've built and are in the process of building, that will help us.
And Michael, you mentioned you run a subsidiary here at Providence St. Joseph Health. I assume these assets that we're talking about here are assets that other health systems can leverage.
Absolutely.
So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that it gets back to some of the points Ari was just making, which is, when we're working in this collaborative environment, we're trying to build solutions that, I view artificial intelligence, for example, it's really part art, part science. It's not a black box you throw data into and you get a solution out the other end. It's important to really balance the needs with embedding intuitive and kind of insight-driven elements to this. And as Ari and Amy talk about the way in which we're thinking about different types of data, that allows us to start to build solutions that are really driven by insights and by intuition, in addition to the power of AI. So when we start to think outside of a Providence network and potentially bringing these solutions to other end users, that's an important element, because you can start to think about, this isn't just a box that was built based on Providence data. These are solutions that are built off of drivers and important factors that are going to be present outside of Providence and in general networks as well.
Thank you. Amy, do you have anything to add on the modeling and the data and the coming surge?
Yeah, so I think there's the data all about predicting what's coming, but there's also data, and Ari mentioned this a little bit, about the real world data that we're getting from looking at our very large data assets across all the patients. We roughly touch somewhere around 14 million patients a year. And so that's a lot of information and data we can cull through. And so we can not only do the clinical research on prospective trials, but also look backwards, doing some health services research and figure out whether or not, do non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs actually make a difference in the long-term outcomes or the predictability of patients with COVID, or do ACE inhibitors, a class of blood pressure medications, make a difference? So we can start learning from experience on medications, and the more data we have, the better, because then the more we can actually make credible associations. And so we're spending a lot of time with our data and analytics, not only predicting what's in the future, but using past performance to say, what are the clinical changes that we can do for patients moving forward until we have this vaccine? The other thing we're doing is working with a broad consortium. We have a whole Providence research network to investigate not just the clinical trials with new drugs, but also the basic science and vaccine research. Everything from looking at, does plasma from patients who've recovered make a difference in preventing bad outcomes in people who have the current infection? And if so, what are those specific antibodies? And can we clone and make those in some other way? So there's a lot of work we can do depending on the data that we're generating from treating people who have this germ.
Yeah, excellent point. We always say hindsight is 20/20, and so bringing up that point of being able to play back kind of what February and March and April look like, and cull back through the data, and were there things we missed, correlations that we didn't see, and that can help our patients going forward. And then if there is a surge in the fall, will help us there as well. Amy, earlier you mentioned artificial intelligence and the bot that we use to triage, and we've obviously talked about artificial intelligence and some of the predictive modeling. Are there other artificial intelligence examples you would share with our audience?
We're also doing things, again, in the algorithms that we're using. We're developing for decision support that we have in our electronic medical record. So how can we take two different points in time, which it might make it hard for any one individual to realize that a blood pressure went down an hour ago, and I'm looking at the pulse now, and that's up. But somehow having artificial intelligence or machine learning go back through and pull out these disparate pieces of data and present them to a clinician in real time is a way to make every clinician an expert clinician, because it helps us see things that we miss. And so having that kind of decision support has really been helpful as we get overwhelmed by the amount of data that's coming in. And that's happening not only for patients in the hospital, but for these patients that we're monitoring at home, both the ones that we're doing for COVID, but also now we provide B2B healthcare services in other hospitals through our telehealth program in about 110 different hospitals. And we're using that data in acute care environments as well, doing decision support for people that are off our own footprint. And so having data assets that help us make ever better decisions, help us present information in a way that's digestible for a busy clinician, has made a big difference for us being able to effectively provide care.
Yeah, it's a great example, but how do we add value to a clinician, right? So often we ask clinicians to put more into the electronic health record than they get out. And, this advent of Internet of Things and big data, artificial intelligence is really key to cull through that data and show that pertinent data to an overworked caregiver. So an excellent example there. Thank you, Amy.
Yeah. Well, the way I keep talking about it with our docs is that the haystack just keeps getting bigger, and it's still got the same number of needles. So how do we find those needles? I'm
going to steal that analogy. That's a good one. Ari, thoughts playing off what Amy said?
Well, one other area that I've been very interested in thinking about the use of AI for has to do with infection prevention. So this is a long-standing interest of mine, and thinking about we're going to be in a situation for a long time, I believe, when we're going to have to care for COVID and non-COVID patients at the same time. And how do we do that? And how do we keep our patients safe? How do we keep our caregivers safe? So one of the things that we've actually started experimenting with is building a graph database to help us understand the network of relationships between patients, caregivers, and other patients. And we're in the process of setting up a very large serological survey, so a test to see which of our caregivers have antibodies. And what I've been thinking about is ways that we can use our data technologies to associate clinicians' interactions with COVID positive patients with risk of clinician acquisition and potentially with risk of hospital spread using that, using those data tools. So we're working on setting that up now.
Yeah, I know Graph was something we used at Microsoft, to really cull through the big data that we had there. Surprised to see that we weren't heavily leveraging it in healthcare. So the example you give is a good one, and I think it'll be really eye-opening how that can show those very complex relationships and potential correlations in this scenario. But I think it's a technology we're going to be able to use in other scenarios as well.
Absolutely agree. I think there's so much potential that's currently untapped in our industry for understanding the relationship between sort of networks and outcomes. A lot of the quality improvement work that we do, the reporting that we do, has to do with tying one doctor to one outcome that a patient experienced, right? Which we all understand doesn't represent reality very well. We care for patients in teams, in the outpatient and in the inpatient setting, right? Imagine that we'd have the ability to look at the relationship between kind of networks of care and the outcomes that our patients experience. And so I'm hoping this is a step in that direction.
Absolutely. Michael, are there artificial intelligence examples you want to share?
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the real challenges with these problems is that you have multiple objectives. So you're talking about not only providing the best patient outcomes and patient experience, but also the caregivers. You have limited resources, not only supplies, but also equipment. And then there's obviously financial considerations too. All of these things are elements of a solution, and building a solution for those types of problems in the presence of incredible uncertainty is extremely challenging. So as we think about scheduling and staffing and trying to increase the satisfaction of both patients and care providers, you start to build solutions which have application well beyond the COVID scenario, into more broadly how you think about hospital operational management, whether it be everything from the emergency room through floor units. These are problems which are really challenging problems. And part of this is the fact that there are so many different potential objectives and so much uncertainty, but we're learning a lot through this process. And I think this will have direct implication on our ability to produce viable solutions for larger problems, more broadly speaking, kind of going forward.
Great, thank you. Well, final question, Amy, I'll start with you. This conversation has been pretty technical, but at the end of the day, it's really about serving our communities. We see a lot of disparities in the way healthcare is delivered and the health of our communities. How do you feel like data and artificial intelligence can really serve those inequities and better deliver healthcare to our communities?
It's what gives me hope, actually. It feels like such an enormous conundrum and such an overwhelming problem. The fact that zip code determines health outcomes more impactfully than genetic code, that the socioeconomic status of an individual determines their longevity in life, their capacity to live without comorbidities, without illness. And so we have to do something different for communities that have less health assets in the community. And to know that, we have to be able to see it, right? We need to be able to have the data to say, this area has a high percentage of heart disease and hypertension. And we know that heart disease, hypertension, and people who live in congregate settings, so a lot of apartment buildings and a lot of homeless shelters, for example, are places that COVID can strike. And so that's where we need to put on-site testing. And it might not be drive-through testing if people don't own cars, right? But it might be a van that goes in and actively seeks out locations where we think risk is high. So I think it's a way, actually having data on where do we see the problem, and that's where we can target solutions, is a way for us to start getting at some of these entrenched inequities in care that right now are driving, huge upheaval in our country. And it's time for us to solve that. And data is one of the ways we can do it.
Can I be so bold to say, if we had these capabilities, the data being uploaded to the cloud, the big data, these analytic tools, we may have seen this pandemic growing before they were showing up in our hospitals? I think about, Kirkland and the epidemic we saw there with some of this data. I feel like we would have had earlier insights before patients showed up. You think we can get there, or is that being too optimistic?
I think that's a great question for Ari with syndromic surveillance. And so because it really is, syndromic surveillance is really looking for, and Ari, I am taking words out of your mouth. So you fill them in.
We're both handed off to Ari. Ari, can you answer that question?
There we go.
Yeah, sure. Well, I don't know if we would have been able to pick up what happened in Kirkland early. But I like to think that we're developing technologies that would have given us a shot. So syndromic surveillance, as we were talking about, is using electronic health record data to identify what patients are actually describing as the problems that they're experiencing, and then looking for patterns in communities of those descriptions of what they're experiencing. I do think that that is a useful tool to serve as an early warning for kind of the canary in the coal mine for what's happening in the community. We're also increasingly doing surveillance, like doing actual laboratory testing in congregate care settings that I think will allow us to detect earlier signal as well.
Great. Thanks. Michael, thoughts on how to better serve these communities?
One thing I would add, I think one of the real strengths of artificial intelligence, and it applies here to the syndromic data, is the fact that one of the real challenges we face is it's one thing to kind of look retrospectively, like you said, BJ, and say, could we have seen something happening? Sure, if we had known to look for that information at the time, then perhaps we would have seen it. But artificial intelligence provides us a potential opportunity to have a system identify things that we aren't necessarily looking for. So it's very, would it be something that would work in the future? There's the potential for it, where you could have a system say, we're seeing something unusual in the data. Could you take a closer look at this with experts and determine if it's something that we should explore further? I think it's a promising area, and you bring up a very good point that prevention is challenging in of itself. Prevention, when you don't necessarily know what you're looking for, can be extremely challenging, and this provides at least a potential way of solving some of those problems.
Yeah, naive perspective from a technologist. I guess what I'm thinking of is, a smart thermometer. People are willing to share a lot of data, and if people shared their smart thermometer and were taking their baseline temperature every day, that was going to the cloud. That's part of our big data models. An artificial intelligence bot could look at, kind of the baseline health of a community. On average, there's so many fevers in Kirkland on any given day, and that artificial intelligence could look for changes in that baseline. Why are there more fevers? Why are there less fevers? It isn't necessarily going to call out that there's COVID here, but it would alert physicians to say there's something going on in this community as a variance from the baseline, kind of look here. Is that, I'll throw myself under the bus, is that naive to think, or do we think that's kind of where IoT, these Internet of Things devices can go, and kind of evaluating the health of a population kind of more proactively?
Can I take that one? Yeah, because I think there's a both and there, BJ. I think that would work in communities where people can afford a Bluetooth enabled thermometer. And there's a lot of communities where people can't afford a Bluetooth enabled thermometer. And so back to what Ari and Michael were talking about before, is we have to be really creative with our use of data so that we can make sure we're representing all communities. Because what I worry about right now is, if you look at meatpacking plants, there's probably very few people that work there that have Bluetooth enabled thermometers. And so what could we do that would enable us to get data from a meatpacking plant? And that might be, sickness claims, days off work, people that called out, so I think we just have to be really thoughtful about what are the data sources we look at, so they're inclusive across the entire spectrum.
No, good point. And, as we start to manage the the health of a population, we may look at those communities and as a health system say it makes more sense to invest in these smart thermometers, give them to communities, give them to those individuals. Obviously, it's a cost to our health system, or it's a cost to the local government or agencies or communities to provide those. But the proactive insight we have, may give us, 1,000x return down the road if we can identify these things in advance. But excellent point. We don't want to create, only health for the affluent and not serve these underserved communities. I'm really glad you called out that as being a gap in my theory. Thanks, Amy. Other thoughts before I wrap it up? I think it's been a good conversation. Really proud of the work we've done at Providence St. Joseph Health, that positive impact we've had on our communities. Like I said, the durable assets I think we've been able to build over the last couple of months will really pay off in the future in the way we serve those communities. So I thank you.
Well, thank you so much for a great conversation.
Well, BJ, monitoring this conversation, I'm awestruck by the insights and perspectives as you are all right at that edge of innovation, leading on that edge in the face of what is this unprecedented global pandemic. Who would have thought just a few months ago we'd be sitting here having this discussion, right? And yet I'm so inspired and again, really awestruck by the conversation because it's forward-leaning, it's results-oriented. And you know what, most importantly, what strikes me is that you all are not only looking at it from a healthcare vantage point, you're looking at it from a cross-sector vantage point, which I think is critically important from technology, and looking at it from the perspective that is so critically important to find these solutions. Zip codes, Amy, you zeroed in on the zip code issue that I've talked a lot about over the years. And I feel like, that's cross-sector because you know what, it's healthcare, it's education, it's finance, it's an overlay. You can overlay all of the issues on the zip code issue, which is if you're not fortunate enough to be in the zip code with all of the accoutrements that you need to have all of these situations addressed, then it's an epic fail. So being able to address all of that holistically is important. But Providence St. Joseph Health has been, at this crisis from the very beginning with the very first patient, as you mentioned. And I'd like to, on behalf of Ideagen, applaud your leadership. The changing, personally and professionally, the acceleration of the delivery of healthcare. Thank you for that. Thank you for all you're doing. And thank you for helping to change the world.
Thank you, George. Appreciate you giving us a platform to share our story, and thank you for the partnership.
It's our honor and privilege. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
My goodness.
Michael and Ari, we lost.
So honored today to have with us Scott Frisch from AARP, EVP and COO. Scott, welcome.
George, good to see you again.
Always great to see you, Scott. And, what an incredible time to have you on the show during what is a global pandemic. What is AARP doing to help people during this time?
Well, it has been a devastating, this pandemic has had a devastating effect on all of us, especially older people. So many have died, but there's also been the destructive effect on health and financial security for many of us. And AARP has been, the role we've been playing is doing what we always do. We're a trusted resource and a strong champion for people in need. And we've been, providing information on caregiving and improvements in nursing homes, making easier for people to get stimulus checks, invoking community connections to combat social isolation. But it's been a difficult time for all of us, and here at AARP we're doing everything we can to help make things a little bit easier.
Scott, what I love about what you just said is exactly that. You are the trusted source of information. As a member myself of AARP, I can tell you, I view AARP in exactly that manner, that you are the trusted source for all of this information during this really unprecedented time where the world, the entire planet, perhaps for the first time in history, is experiencing the same exact thing, right? In every corner of the world. We talk to people all over the world with interviews, and they're experiencing exactly the same thing with this pandemic. And so during this time, so many people are hurting and impacted, obviously. What do you see as AARP's role? I know a lot of people turn to AARP. What would you see that key role being?
Well, I think, again, it comes down to what we've been doing for the last 60 years. We are a trusted resource to provide information, education, and content to our members and the society as a whole, especially those that are over the age of 50. Our ability to act as a convener to bring people to the table, to talk about these issues, to communicate what's happening, I think has been an extremely important role that AARP has played over the last, whatever it is, 11, 12 weeks. I think the days start to run into one another nowadays.
That's right. And what's remarkable, personally and professionally, and looking what AARP is doing, is that you pivoted so quickly because you have been a convener. And it's not a new thing. It's not like you just started connecting and partnering with other organizations. And the fact that you're that trusted source of information and leadership is not by accident either. I mean, this is all part of the organizational mission, right? To help these vulnerable populations that you're so focused on assisting, so that we all have the most updated data and guidance, et cetera, in a way that makes sense. You didn't know this was coming. So how have you been able to position yourself?
Well, position ourselves in terms of this entire pandemic, I'd say I can wrap it up pretty simply. Our mission is to empower people to choose how they live as they age. So if you think about it in those terms, being that trusted resource is exactly what we do, and we've been doing it for so long. And we're in a fortunate position. We've been able to continue to do this and provide this information and bring people together during this pandemic, while we've all been in a remote status for the last 11 or 12 weeks.
That's right. And so what lessons can be drawn from this, Scott? What can we actually learn from all of this?
Well, let's talk about, let's focus on the remote work for a second. Because I think, along with many other things in this pandemic, this will potentially change society. And, it's very difficult to sit here and predict the future. Anybody that can usually gets it wrong, or tries to usually gets it wrong. I'm not necessarily going to say I have all the answers here, but it does beg the question about what does life look like when this is over, or when there's a vaccine, or if there isn't a vaccine. But getting to the remote status, and you and I doing this remotely here, working remotely is one issue. Second is, as it relates to the employer, it really reinforces our ability to have a flexible work environment. And we've been doing that at AARP in a number of ways. One thing that we're most proud of is we launched a caregiving leave benefit, I want to say a year and a half to 2 years ago, where we give every employee 80 hours of paid caregiving leave. Combined with our traditional flexible work arrangements around telecommute, telework, phasing retirement, et cetera, that has been very important for us to migrate and to allow us to continue to serve our social mission during this pandemic and while we're on a remote basis.
Incredible. And that's something that, again, with leadership, with your leadership and that of Joanne Jenkins' leadership as CEO of the organization, you all have been preparing as if for anything to maintain that continuity, right?
Correct. So, I'd like to say over the last 3 or 4 years, we made a very concerted effort to build a what we call the AARP preparedness function, which is really business continuity, to allow ourselves to prepare for a variety of events, whether it's the hurricanes that hit our offices in one of our state locations, snowstorms, any weather event, earthquakes, and I guess for a global pandemic, which I must say we didn't exactly have on our list of things to consider, but all the steps that we put in place to build up for these events has allowed us to pivot go to a remote work site location or remote working environment, and utilizing some of our off-site business continuity areas where it was allowed, really has allowed us to continue to function as is, and we have not seen a drop off in productivity at all. So it definitely has reinforced the notion that you need to be prepared. You need to think about what these events mean. What does your infrastructure need to take to be able to handle thousands of concurrent users at once? What are all those backup procedures that people talk about? So we have a book on the shelf that says, here's our plan, but you have to test the plan to make sure it works, and you have to continue to learn from those tests. So when an event like this happens, and hopefully this is a once in a lifetime or once in every 100-year event, the organization can continue to function as is. And we've been, thankfully, been able to do so without a hitch.
That's right. And it didn't happen by accident that you were prepared, because, as you said, you've been preparing for several years now for continuity of operations, which is a fundamental component that really any organization or business should have. And there's certain elements of that we can all learn from, right? In terms of partnerships and being able to pivot with partnerships that were created pre-pandemic. They now count on to say, I know the capacity of this other organization, company, NGO, public sector, et cetera. We can partner, we can take advantage of that to work together, et cetera, in ways that are not being created now, which is much more difficult, right, to create new partnerships at this moment. So that foresight, that strategic foresight that you all have embodied in your mission is to be commended. And so I'd like to ask you about older workers in a bit in technology. What are some of these stereotypes that you've seen and the myths associated with those?
Well, it's a subject that we're very familiar with, and let's talk about pre-pandemic for a second. So the myths, the myths of the older worker being someone that doesn't handle technology well, or they're too expensive to hire, or they're too costly to retain, or they're out of touch. I think before the pandemic, those were, I guess I can say it, those were receding. They weren't gone. But if you specifically look at the technology aspect, and I would say there is any silver lining, and there are a few silver linings in this pandemic, but one is, I'd like to think that the digital skills gap, or the age-based digital skills gap, better said, has shrunk because of this pandemic, because technology is now everywhere. Everybody's using Zoom or Microsoft Teams or Skype, or FaceTiming your relatives, or FaceTiming your kids, or FaceTiming your friends for a Friday afternoon or Saturday afternoon get together. I think it's become so ubiquitous, the stigmatism around the older adult not being able to handle technology has significantly shrunk. And I think we'll continue to do so. And I've always said that today's 60-year-old understands and treats technology vastly different than the 60-year-old of 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. Just like 20 years from now, that technology gap for that 60 or that 50 or that 70-year-old will be vastly different than what it is today. So I think that's one big thing is around the technology gap and how it's been receding. I think the other thing that's been come into play here is some of the things that older workers do is that they bring a level of institutional knowledge and experience and perspective. And again, this is not just for older workers, but it is. Our research shows that they bring a certain level of perspective and experience to situations. And having gone through other major events, whether it was 9/11, whether it was the 08-09 crisis, add this to the list. That level of experience and perspective has been invaluable during this entire pandemic. And the last point I'd like to add, I know I'm getting a little long here, but the last point I'd like to add that ties to that is the value of mentorships between the older worker and a younger worker, whether it's and it goes both ways, but that mentorship, especially in times like now where there's a high level of anxiety, it's a high level of discomfort, nervousness, those are invaluable traits that the older worker brings to the workforce.
That's right. And what you're doing is highlighting the fact that these older workers are actually more astute in technology in so many areas than perhaps even some younger folks. And there's not that imbalance or that inability to work with technology to effectively navigate all of these different mediums, like you said. And that really drives us into my next question, which relates to employer flexibility. God, why is that important? We're all seeing, and we're all sort of working in different modes. Some are in the office, some are not, most are not. How can we, look at the employer flexibility piece, and what's some advice you can provide on that?
Well, as I said earlier, the flexibility around your telework policies is very important. I think what this pandemic has done is brought to the forefront the point that you can be productive working remotely. You can be productive not being in the office. I was on a call the other day with a woman from the New America Foundation that had said the remote working, I'm going to hopefully get this pretty accurate, the remote working concept was really for the mummy track, for the women that became mothers, and that was the way they would that was the way they'd be communicating within the workforce. That's not the case with this. I mean, I think this has proven that we all can do things remotely. Now, it's also, I believe, forced companies to rethink many things. Commercial real estate, what is their policy around who can work from home? Can you have a function that can be permanently working from home? It's difficult to make these types of decisions while in the middle of a crisis, but it does force organizations to really rethink what it means to have a flexible workforce.
That's right. And going back to older workers, can you talk a little bit about soft skills? Tell us a little bit about your perspective on that. And what about age discrimination?
Well, I think the telework really enforces, the concept of telework really enforces the need for these soft skills like problem solving or collaboration and teamwork. And those are traits that the older worker does bring to the table. And it's been sharpened through years of experience. So I think it's extremely important. And again, touching on the mentorship, mentee relationship, in this environment of anxiety, having those relationships, having those soft skills to be able to interact with people in face-to-face translates, if not equally, or even more important when you're on a telework basis. Having said that, you brought up age discrimination. Age discrimination, while illegal, unfortunately still exists in the workplace. It's funny. It's one of those few things that people can make fun of and not be in trouble for. And that's why we've, under our CEO's direction, this concept of disrupt aging, which is basically changing the conversation of what it means in this country to age, not only in this country, in fact, going abroad as well. But age discrimination is unfortunately still alive and well. I think there was a survey that we did in 2017 that said more than 6 in 10 older workers reported seeing or experiencing age discrimination on the job. And it's difficult. It's not like someone's going to stand up on top of their desk and shout age discrimination. It comes in many other subtle ways. And then, for those that unfortunately lose their job, the older worker takes exponentially longer to be rehired, and usually it's at a reduced level of earnings. I think 9 in 10 older workers say their job after they've been let go is usually less than what they made prior to that. Now, the good news is, prior to the pandemic, the unemployment rate for the older worker, I want to say, was about 3.9%. So that is a good thing in the sense that more older workers are in the workforce. It's becoming more normal. People are getting used to it. Combine that with hopefully this technology, age-based technology divide shrinking. Maybe those are two impetuses for age discrimination to begin to be eliminated once and for all.
Well, thanks to your work, I'm sure that's the case, and it will happen because of the hard work and ongoing efforts of AARP for sure. And shifting back to working from home. What, Scott, do you see as some of the downsides to working from home?
Well, I think it's there's a few of them. I think first and foremost, human beings are social creatures, and there's that level of interaction that you need to be in person. And it's great, you and I sitting here across two computer screens, and we can still interact, but it's not the same as though you and I were sitting in person and getting that social connection. So, ensuring that we have that social connection is really important. And a lot of older workers, especially, use, for those that that are working either because they have to or because they want to. A lot of us use the workforce as a means to get that social interaction, and because social isolation is an issue, is a big issue, especially as you get older. So if you lose that, degree or a certain element of that social connection from the workforce, that's difficult. I mean, that's a big hole for people, very big hole.
That's right. And then how do you keep, so you and I, we've met, I know you, so it's a little bit easier to conduct an interview because we've had the opportunity to meet in person, et cetera. But how do you keep relationships strong in a remote environment?
Well, I mean, it's not easy, but what it takes, in some ways, it's no different than what it is in the in-person environment. It takes effort. Yeah. You have to be able to pick up the phone and call or send an email or a text. How you doing? How are you feeling? It's not just, hey, I need something, but it's that human connection. It's no different in work or your family or your friends. You need to be able to pick up the phone and, hey, George, how's things going? How's the family? How's business going? It doesn't have to have any agenda other than just checking in on people. And I think that that helps solve that problem. And I think it helps to reduce that problem, at least. That's my optimistic view of life, I guess.
Yeah, we all remain optimistic for sure. And I agree with you. I think, that empathy piece has come up so much and so many different conversations we've been having recently. And I think that's what you do well, and what AARP does so well is empathy, understanding what it is that issues are, and then help address them in some ways. And so where are we all going in terms of the future of work? I mean, you've got that strategic foresight, the ability to see around some corners. Where do you see things going in the future of work?
Well, again, it's very difficult to predict the future. And you may see certain trends happening today that may not be there once we get out of this pandemic and we get back to a version of new normal. But having said that, I do think there are a couple things, and we've touched on some of them. One is the concept of workplace flexibility, whether it's demanded by the employee or suggested or implemented by the employer. I think workplace flexibility is going to be a much bigger item in the future. I think the remote working status combined with that flexibility, I think it's proven that productivity, at least so far, can be achieved. I think it will be interesting to think about what happens, though, from a productivity standpoint when you do have a hybrid environment. So today we've proven that productivity is fine. At least at AARP, we have not seen a drop off with everybody being remote. What happens when you have an organization that has a hybrid version? Forget the percentages of who's in the office versus out of the office, but will that productivity remain? I hope it does. I hope that technology allows us to do that, and I believe it will. But again, until we know for sure, until we actually, live in it, we won't know for sure. But I will say, as it relates to the older worker, which is what AARP, obviously we're very thoughtful about. I do think this concept of a multi-generational workforce is here to stay. And whether it's because of that technology divide has shifted or decreased or lessened, multi-generational teams within organizations are something that are here to stay. So again, no one can predict the future, and we have to get through this. But you have to keep the eye on the ball on certain trends and what's happening in your own organization and others.
Well, it's heartening to hear that, and it's really great news. Really great news to hear that the digital divide generationally is shrinking, and that perhaps is accelerated as a result and effect of this situation that we're in. We're hearing from folks like yourself, CEOs, COOs, et cetera, that are all talking about the acceleration of areas in their planning that were 2, 3, 5, 7 years out that have been happening in 8 weeks. And it's incredible to see and to hear that. And so what can we all learn from each other, including internationally? I mean, what can we learn here?
Well, I will say, it's funny about the acceleration point and I just want to come back to something I said. So we've been remote for whatever is 11 weeks, but it was a Thursday afternoon, and we, on a Thursday we said, next day we're going to test our remote systems. Everybody go remote on that. It was a Friday, March, 12th or 11th, whatever that Friday was. And we made the decision over the weekend to go 100% remote starting that Monday. And I think if it weren't for a couple of individuals, home internet connections, we didn't miss a beat. So we made that decision, very quickly, because we had the foresight, at least the planning, thankfully, to allow us to do that. But lessons learned going forward, whether it's domestic or international, we are a global environment. We do live in a global community. To your earlier point, when you opened it up, everyone is experienced think about it. Every country, everybody, every individual is experiencing almost the same thing as it relates to this pandemic at the same time. It's just amazing to be able to see this. But it does show that you need to have some planning. You need to think about your workforce, think about your organization. How does it survive? And it just takes time, effort, and it's not, doing it's not fun up front. All that work is not going to generate new sales in the moment, but it's going to allow you to continue to function and continue operations in the event of a situation like this or something comparable.
Well, and in your role, gosh, that's right in the middle of your job description, right? Chief Operating Officer. I mean, you're the person that's in charge of the operations of this incredible organization, and I want to applaud you for having the ability and the insight and the willingness to lead and to help with Joanne and planning and taking this organization forward, albeit digitally now, and to continue to be an incredible voice, honestly, for what I see is such an incredibly important part of this global community, the older populations. I mean, it's just profound. The messages that have come out by the organization, the guidance, the leadership, all of these things together help form a collaborative effort that I think is really important for people to see a roadmap that we can get out of this. Here are lessons. And by the way, the overall lesson that I see is also what AARP has done in general to continue operations. And that lesson can be shared and is being shared, obviously, through this interview with other companies, NGOs, public sector, to say, okay, planning is important. Partnerships are critical, and not just in times of need. I mean, you have to have those relationships in place so that you're able to, in some fashion, continue. And by the way, you have an added pressure, which is people look to you. You're that trusted advisor. You're that trusted advisor for this older population, one of these vulnerable populations as well, as we've seen in this pandemic, that are looking for this information, Scott. So personally, professionally, I applaud you and everything that you're doing. And I'd like to talk just a little bit about the work you've done with, for example, the World Economic Forum, the OECD, Living, Learning, Earning Longer, LLEL, and Collaborative, where you share best practices. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, first of all, I think on behalf of all of us at ARP, thank you for those comments about us. It's been a lot of time spent by a very large team who has put their heart and soul into making sure ARP is here to do its social mission. So thank you for that. our work with the World Economic Forum and the OECD around the Living, Learning, and Earning Longer Collaborative, that's a mouthful, is really about working with global companies to explore the business case for age diversity and highlight promising practices from around the world. So it's a lot to do with what a multi-generation workforce brings to an organization, specific around recruitment and retention, flexible work, all the things we've been talking about, caregiving benefits, lifelong learning, which we didn't touch on, is, I think, if anything, is one of those trends is going to continue to occur over the next generation. You can't always just get your education from those 4 years in college or wherever period it ends. It's a lifelong event. So we're excited about it. We've had a great relationship with both organizations. I think our report is going to be issued, I believe, in the 2021 World Economic Forum at Davos. So looking forward to that.
And again, important to note, this is a global, the global reach and issue that you're working on, and we've seen it again, time and time again. We saw what happened in Italy with the older population there, and just across the world. It's been just breathtaking in a positive and also in a scary way on how this older population across the world has endured this pandemic. But yet there's the light at the end of the tunnel, which is an organization like AARP helping with so much information, so much guidance, and again, serving as that trusted advisor for so many across the planet. And so, Scott, final question. Mm-hmm. How do we embrace the future?
Well, that's an interesting question, George. I think, listen, I think at the end of the day, I'm an optimistic individual. Although my day job takes me into a lot of the details and nuts and bolts of running an organization from an operations perspective. I think I'm optimistic about the future despite where we are today. We've survived things in the past, and we'll come through this hopefully a lot stronger than where we started when it began.
Well, and I'm confident that that's the case because of your and Joanne's and the entire organization's leadership at AARP. Thank you from Ideagen, from all of us at Ideagen, to you, everyone at AARP, for everything that you're doing to help folks across the planet survive, and not only survive, but thrive. Scott Frisch, EVP and COO, AARP, thank you for changing the world.
Thank you, George.
John, what an amazing summit this has been. We've had so many great guests with really inspiring talks. Thank you to all of our participants and viewers here at the Global Innovation 2030 Digital Summit.
Absolutely, Cooper. I couldn't agree more. We've heard some really insightful and inspiring things today. And now, to close it out, I would like to introduce Dr. Siddhant Gupta, the chairman of the Ideagen Advisory Board. Dr. Gupta, welcome.
Thank you, both of you. Absolutely an amazing digital summit, a first for Ideagen. The pandemic, as probably you all know, threw a little wrench in all of our plans. But something I've noticed with the pandemic is the silver lining, is we all came together. You can see this all across different parts of the government, public, private sector. Folks came together to tackle this global pandemic, and we are putting a really strong fight. And that gives me the context for claiming and asserting that we have no excuse not to go after and solve some of the more bigger problems, and particularly focus on SDGs. We've shown that we can come together and work on these problems. So, I encourage all of the Ideagen community to keep that in mind. The way I think about it is, more than ever before, it is clear that we all have a responsibility to be an active and intentional participant in creating an inclusive and diverse environment. And empathy plays a key role there. It starts with our relationships. It starts with our relationship with colleagues at home. And with those guiding principles and what we saw with the pandemic, us coming together, I think we can work together as a single human population to uplift everyone out of poverty, create equality, provide equity, and tackle some of the vexing sustainable development goals for 2030. We only have 10 years, but I think that's enough time given how impressive it's been. And in closing, I wanted to highlight that, especially for our viewers, that we'll have 17 days of sustainability presented by Ideagen sometime in July, where we'll double click in each of the sustainable goals. We'll have some great content, talks and speakers where we'll go in depth into each of the sustainable goals. And with that, I would like to close the summit. And thank you so much for watching our first ever digital summit. Thank you.